All right. I am Ben Burgis. This is Brent Lengel.
Howdy.
Brent is, as well as being a YouTuber, a debater, is also a writer. And you should check out, he's got a Kickstarter project going. There is a link in the description for this video. We'll definitely talk about that before we go. But I want to talk about the debate we're about to watch. So this is something that that you kind of alerted me to the existence of, and for a variety of reasons, I couldn't not do this. But who are these people? What are they arguing about?
So this is two prominent anarcho capitalists, Dr. David D. Friedman, the son of Milton Friedman, and Walter Block, who is a big proponent of the Austrian School of Economics. And they're going to be arguing about Austrian School Economics versus Chicago School Economics.
Yeah, so both of these gentlemen are people I've debated, David Friedman and Walter Block.
I've debated David as well with American Johnson of non-compete. I have not, unlike you, I have not had a chance to lock horns with Walter Block.
Yeah. It was interesting. Actually, let me see if I can find, there's this really memorable thing here from moment from it. Let's see if I can just pull this up. Here we go. So this is probably a little unfair, but I can't resist. We all, like sometimes in the heat of making a point, put things oddly, and so this was just a little 30 seconds where Walter Block did that with me, and it's our producer at the time captured it and did a little slow motion thing. So this is, I think it's actually much funnier out of context. We'll just do that. So
black people, and I wanted to promote black. If I were the king of the black people and I wanted to promote black wealth.
Your eyebrows did exactly the same thing mine did. Oh God.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, I think the sentence was probably something like, if I were the king of the black people and I wanted to promote black welfare, I would, I don't know, end the minimum wage so more people get jobs or something like that. I mean, this is the kind of viewpoint we're dealing with here.
I love that they think that's a good argument. like there are some conservatives right now just like sitting there like, man, I can't wait to tell some lefty commie that if I were king of the black people.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah, I'm really excited that you wanted to do this, because normally we kind of look at one where there's at least one socialist voice involved in the debate. But this here, it's as you've described it, it's alien versus predator.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, so it's like both the fact that these are both people I've talked to in the past, Block and Friedman. So, Friedman, is the as you mentioned, the son of Milton Friedman, and sort of trying to continue the intellectual project of his father and mother, I should say. Milton and Rose Friedman actually co-wrote a book, what I often think of as kind of the Necronomicon of right-wing economics, Free to Choose. And although I think his position is more extreme than his parents was, as you mentioned, like he they just had like sort of ultimately kind of normie libertarian conclusions, and whereas as David is is a anarcho-capitalist, and then Walter Block, who I think many people probably know from his discussions with Sam Cedar on the Majority Report. So these are both known quantities, but also just that topic, right? Austrian versus Chicago school economics, is like really what.
Ben? I got to tell you, there's a big difference. Do you want the economic school that was championed by a guy who worked for a fascist government, or the economic school that was championed by a guy who worked for the fascist government?
Yeah, right. So I mean, I guess to be fair, the Friedman, Friedman family, Friedman Senior, of course, famously flew down to Chile to give economic advice to Pinochet after the coup to overthrow the democratically elected government of Salvador Allende, and like the kind of beginning of this reign of terror in Haiti, where they do things like where many people were disappeared, and kind of union activists, socialists, were like hung out of helicopters, or just like quietly shot and buried in an unmarked grave somewhere. And I think actually almost kind of more disturbing than the kind of economic advice itself is the fact that he wrote this kind of fawning letter afterwards, thanking him for his hospitality and saying it's like nice to see that Chile's back on the right track.
I should mention, by the way, the Pinochet, just so people can understand like how crazy the Pinochet regime was. Like he employed a one-eyed former Nazi SS wannabe. So he was a Nazi. He did fight for the Nazis. He tried to get into the SS, but he put out his eye trying to untie his shoelace. And this guy ran a cult, was the primary torturer for him. And at one point, because he was jealous of the kids in his cult that were really excited about Santa Claus, literally shot a guy in a Santa Claus costume, pretending that he'd shot Santa out of the air. So, just a little bit of background on just how nuts Pinochet and the people that he employed were. I do want to say though, from the time that I debated his son David, like, I disagree with him on a ton of stuff, but I gotta say he's one of the more pleasant people that I like him personally, like a lot. And so I don't want to paint him with like too broad of a brush. I still like my debate with him on Modern Day Debate is still probably my favorite.
Yeah, I should say too, while we are talking about the softer side of these people, that when I brought Walter Block on the show, he mentioned a fascinating, or actually I asked him about, because I'd seen it elsewhere. Like I was kind of looking up all of his content, before we talked, biographical detail about him, which is that he went to high school with Bernie Sanders, and they were on the track team together. And I think he even said like they'll still like talk like every 10 years or so. Like he said they just don't talk about politics.
That's adorable, actually. I kind of like that. Though I gotta say, if I was in that position, I'd definitely talk about politics every 10 years.
Oh, fair enough. So yeah, this is something that this is something that, so putting aside these people and the kind of intellectual legacies they represent, I should say that Block is somebody who kind of came out of originally like the Ayn Rand movement. He was like, it was, oh my God, I don't remember his name, but like Rand's like longtime boyfriend, I think. Do you remember that dude's name?
No, but I know who you're talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, because like Murray Rothbard was in that circle as well, though he had a falling out with Rand. And oh Lord, what was because there was also an affair involved.
Yeah. No, there's some drama here. But in any case, that dude was the one who apparently originally brought Walter around to libertarianism. I know the Rand people don't like that word, but whatever. What we call libertarianism. And then so he was kind of in the Ayn Rand circle for a minute, and then he kind of decided that he liked the economics better than the weird philosophy. And then he dropped out of that, and then I think he was associated with Rothbard for a long time. Rothbard himself is a fascinatingly strange character in many ways. Like he's somebody who, in like the late 60s, early 70s, he went through this sort of new left period where he was like he still kind of believed some version of all of the sort of crazy libertarian economic things, but was sort of trying to find a way to fit it with like hanging out with the new left of that time period.
Yeah.
So he
trying to fit it with actual libertarianism.
He wrote this article called, was it Confiscation in the Homesteading Principle, where he says like that actually you don't have property rights if you're like, if you're a corporation and like and any significant portion of your profits come from like Pentagon contracts or whatever, then you shouldn't have any claim on property rights. And actually if somebody has to homestead, then like the workers are the ones who would have homesteading rights. And so there's this sort of way of like kind of building socialism with all of his sort of lifelong beliefs. But then I think he gave that up pretty quickly. And
if I'm not mistaken, by the way, because that version of Rothbard is actually really similar to I forget the name of the strike, but it was workers who were striking. I believe it was Carnegie. It was Carnegie. And their argument was essentially that because they had put in so much labor towards building, I think it was a mine, might have been a railroad, but essentially it should be partially theirs. That was the direct argument that they made, that we homesteaded this, we mixed our labor with the land, therefore, maybe we don't have to own all of it, but we should own some of it. And Carnegie was just like, no. And probably had quite a few murdered.
Sure, I would imagine that was kind of how that tended to go back then. But yeah, so anyway, yeah, that sort of, so he had this kind of weird like quasi like syndicalist kind of phase like in like the new left era, and then he got over it very quickly, and by like the 80s sometime, I think, he was actually like a big proponent of like libertarian paleocon kind of fusionism, and like
he endorsed David Duke or at least, I don't know if he officially endorsed David Duke, but he lamented David Duke, being no longer considered a viable presidential candidate.
Yeah, and yeah, I mean, I know he seemed very friendly to like the Pat Buchanan campaign for president, and like if you read Rothbard's stuff from the 90s, it's like pretty it's pretty unlibertarian in a right wing direction, but yeah, like I think by some accounts at least, I think Rothbard and Lew Rockwell might have been responsible for those Ron Paul newsletters that became an issue for a minute in 2012. If anybody can remember that.
I had heard that it was Jeffrey Tucker. I don't know. There's no confirmation, but I know he was asked about it and gave somewhat of a evasive answer.
Okay, that could be. But in any case, like I think Rothbard and Rockwell were both like certainly the political zone where people might suspect things like that at that point, right? The sort of like, I'm a libertarian, but also I want like cops to crack the heads of people, who are rioting in the inner cities or whatever.
Mm-hmm. So, yeah, there, and of course, Rothbard famously had like unleash the cops. Law enforcement needs to be able to administer instant justice or something. No, instant punishment. That's what he said.
Awesome.
Yeah, I will say Jeffrey Tucker, he scored some points with me because he yelled at Richard Spencer when the alt-right was really trying to ingratiate themselves at the Libertarian Conference. So, good on you for that.
Yeah. There's always, you can always have that past that bar of not a Nazi. Uh, so yeah. So one reason that I think this is going to be interesting to watch, beyond the fact that it's just like sort of fascinatingly strange that it happened, is that I think most lefties, like, they hear these phrases, you know, Chicago school economics, Austrian economics. It all kind of blurs together into this sort of like general buzz of like, oh, you know, these are like super hardcore free market, like kind of right wing economic ideas, which is true. But it's going to be interesting to see like what the difference is and what they're arguing about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like to get a fit for this, like Rothbard famously argued that that there should be a flourishing free market in children,
Right.
which is hilarious because it showed that he clearly was not paying attention to history, because there already was a free market in children, and it actually it resulted in this one woman kidnapping like 5,000 babies to resell them. Also look up like orphan trains. What they used to do was selling orphans like to people out west from the inner cities.
Yeah, so Rothbard argues that if we had a free market in babies, then you know they would tend to go towards people who were really they really wanted children, and they had resources, and so you know that it would be better for the children. That does get you that does give you some sense of how he saw the world, for sure.
Yeah. And by the way, to bring this back to Dr. David D. Friedman, one of the things about him that sets him apart, at least in his reputation, is that he tends to approach libertarianism from a consequentialist place, which is very rare. And I think that puts him in a position to make probably one of the strongest cases for libertarianism, whereas like most of the libertarians tend to be deontological or rule based. So they'll throw something out like NAP, you have to respect the non-aggression principle, and of course like a consequentialist is usually like, okay, why? So I like that David makes an effort to paint a picture that we would actually benefit from this, rather than just trying to follow the advice of philosopher kings.
Yeah, no, that's right. So, and this is definitely a big difference between them, besides the different economic theories that Walter Block is very much an NIP guy. And that's kind of a lot of what we, I mean, it's been a while, you know, I don't remember in too much detail, but I think that's a lot of what we end up getting into in that debate is this sort of deontological property rights argument for libertarianism. And I think he's probably much more typical of libertarians in that, you know, kind of trying to play both sides of the street on that one, that okay, on the one hand, there are these non-consequence based, just sort of pure principled arguments for for libertarian economics, but on the other hand, don't worry, it'll all turn out for the best. and whereas David D. Friedman is very much focused on the second part of that, right? You know, he's not going to argue that it's, you know, like he's not going to actually make the sort of in principle argument. I think he's going to say, I mean, you know, it's sort of based. I mean, it's a weird kind of consequentialism because it's consequentialism that's based not really on we went out and checked out the consequences and this is what we found, right? It's more based on sort of
hypothetical consequences. Yeah,
extrapolation from first principles, you know, kind of still, you know, but at least it's about telling some sort of story about how to make things better for everybody. You know,
absolutely. There is one other thing that separates them, and this actually scores a huge number of points with me. Unironically, David D. Friedman does SCA, the Society for Creative
I do bring that up,
which is I'm sorry, that is cool. I'm a giant nerd, so what I think is cool is maybe not what other people think. But yeah, that's badass. It's exactly what I would be doing in his position.
Fair enough. Well, hey, we should probably get started.
Yeah. I can't wait to dig in.
Let's do it.
So, just to introduce both of you, you're both esteemed professors or doctor. You both have doctorates. Dr. David Friedman and Dr. Walter Block. Dr. Block is a professor at Loyola. He has written Machinery of Freedom.
Oh no, that's David's book.
Dr. Block wrote Defending the Undefendable, 1 and 2, maybe 3. I'm not sure. And then we have David Friedman, who wrote Machinery of Freedom. He is the son of Milton Friedman, but he's a little bit different. You know, you'll figure out why later if you aren't already familiar with him. They're both anarcho-capitalists, but they take very different approaches to economics, and they're also both economists. So this is going to be really interesting to see who wins this debate and who comes out on top. So who would like to go first? Did we decide that?
Walter is going first. We agreed on
Right. Okay. So also before I go, we should also clarify. So we're going to start off in 30-minute blocks. Each are going to get 30 minutes to speak. There's going to be a 10-minute rebuttal. And then after that, we're going to get into the Q&A. And then I believe after that, we're going to have, we're going to round things up with 10 minutes apiece. And, whatever happens. So let's go for it.
Okay, well, first, I'm sure in behalf of David, I thank Logan for putting this on. And in the preliminary, we've each decided that we're going to try to convert the other. David is going to try to convert me to Chicagoism. I'm going to try to convert him to Austrianism. I failed with my teacher, Gary Becker. He was my thesis advisor. I'm sure David will have no objection to me counting Gary Becker as a Chicagoan, even though at the time he was at Columbia, because there are many universities of Chicago, as I'm sure David again will agree. There's the University of Chicago in Los Angeles, UCLA. There's the University of Chicago in New York, namely Columbia, when Gary Becker was there. Not so much nowadays, but in those days. And my critique will be of Chicagoites wherever they are, not necessarily at Chicago, and I'm sure David will not object to that. Okay, so let me tell you my story with Gary Becker. I was writing my PhD on rent control, and he was my thesis advisor. And my thesis was that rent control screws up housing. It creates, shortages and lousy housing. And I did an econometric analysis where my main independent variable was numbers of years of rent control. New York City still had it, other cities didn't. And I try to control for everything else I could think of under the sun, namely wealth or weather or north-south dummy variable, anything I could throw, any kitchen sink I could throw in there in order to hold everything else constant. And most of the times I did pretty well. I got the right signs, namely the more rent control, the lousier housing in various ways. And usually it was statistically significant. But every once in a while, I got the wrong sign. And embarrassingly, every once in a while, the wrong sign was statistically significant. And I would show this to Gary. And Gary was a nice guy. What I thought he really meant was block you moron, go out again and do it till you get it right. What he said was, Walter, go out and do it again until you get it right. So what was testing what? And I was trying to convert him to Austrianism by saying, look, we know what's right about rent control. And this econometric regression, what's testing what is the opposite way around. Namely, the theory is testing my econometrics, which sometimes was okay and sometimes was not. And yet this is the very opposite of the logical positivist view, where you're supposed to be testing theory. And I tried my best to convert him out of it, and I didn't succeed. But I maintain that what's going on here when we test the minimum wage is, or test free trade, or test anything of which we have theories on. We don't have any theories about what the elasticity of bananas is. That's a purely empirical thing, and there's no. The only way to find that out is to do an empirical test. But we have theories about rent control, minimum wage, free trade, other things like that. And what's testing what is not the econometrics testing the theory, it's just illustrating it. And sometimes, as in Card and Kruger with their crappy stuff on minimum wage, I think the illustration was wrong, but it's always an illustration. It's never a test. Okay, I now want to talk about praxeology. And I'm going to have to share a screen here. So let me pull up a screen. I'm going to clear all the drawings. And what we've got here is analytic, and we have synthetic. And we have over here a priori and a posteriori. And that gives us 4 boxes. And what we have now is, this would be a tautology. If it's, by the way, analytic and synthetic are a logical or empirical status of a sentence, whereas a priori and a posteriori is how do we get there? And we get there either by thinking, in this case, or by examining reality, looking at reality. And over here we have a tautology. All bachelors, unmarried men, elephants or big gray animals, things like that. These are analytic based on the status, and they're a priori based on how we know them. They're absolutely necessarily true, but they don't tell us about the real world. They only tell us about how we're using words. Synthetic would be praxeology. Synthetic a priori would be praxeology. And I say that these are necessarily true and also do talk about reality. This area, there's no such thing here, and this would be empirical stuff. It's raining outside. And if you're going to find out if it's raining outside, you have to look outside and test it. So these are the 4 things, and I'm sure David will agree with me that there are tautologies, and I'm sure he'll agree with me that there are empirical statements which we have to test. Where David and I think, part company is, I think there is such a thing as a synthetic a priori, and I think he thinks that there's no such thing as a synthetic a priori. So again, what is a synthetic a priori statement? A synthetic a priori statement is something that is absolutely necessarily true, apodictic, cannot be denied. To deny it is to commit a logical contradiction, and yet it tells us something about reality. And for David, who is a logical positivist, along with most economists, he would say, there ain't no such thing here. This yes, but David would put a cross there if I read him correctly. Okay, let me get out of this and let me talk about some examples. And remember, there are 3 things: tautologies, empirical statements, and synthetic a prioris. Now, not all Austrians agree with this. I'm sort of channeling Mises and Rothbard here, not Hayek. Hayek did not go along with this. So let me give some cases. Whenever 2 people, A and B, engage in a voluntary exchange, they both expect to profit from it, otherwise they wouldn't do it. And they have a reverse preference order for the goods and services exchanged, so that A values what he receives from B more highly than what he gives to him, and B must evaluate the same things the other way around. Whenever voluntary trade occurs, both parties intend to improve their economic welfare. Both parties necessarily do, at least ex ante. I'm now going to buy David's shirt, the University of Chicago shirt, and I'm going to pay him $50 for it. And let's say David agrees to sell me his shirt. Well, this must mean that I value.
I really didn't want to stop during his opening statement, but he really likes these shirt examples. In the debate with me, I was wearing that like Michigan State University hoodie I wear sometimes, and he used multiple examples about taking my shirt, and if I got that shirt, I took that shirt, and it seemed like slightly strange, but so it's just kind of funny to see him use this again. Man, based on what I've heard about the difference so far, I've got to say Chicago seems less crazy.
Yeah, well, he's doing this classical thing. So one of the reasons I wanted to do this debate with you is I have been arguing off and on with ANCAP since like 2014. Like when OWS finally completely petered out, I was like, well, what am I going to do with myself now? Oh, fake anarchists. And as I did it so long, I fought the final boss, David D. Friedman. But like, this is just like a classic thing where he was trying to get around it, but he was saying that like essentially economics are too complicated to be studied empirically, and therefore we need this praxeology. If anybody's wondering what praxeology is, it's sort of their equivalent of dialectical materialism, but it's like the Kmart dialectical materialism, and it's idealistic as opposed to empirical.
Yeah. I mean, I kind of think it's similar to what some people mean by dialectical materialism, and that's not an analogy that makes me feel more warmly towards dialectical materialism, at least in the sense that they mean. Actually, yeah, I think there's definitely something there because, like, you could understand, Marx's, materialist theory of history in a way where, like, what G.A. Cohen does in his book, Karl Marx's Theory of History, where, you sort of spend, hundreds of pages kind of like disambiguating it, like, okay, here are three things this might mean, this is the one that seems most plausible. Could we make an argument for it? Do we need to revise it? Right. And I think you get, there are problems and there are legitimate criticisms or whatever, but like, I think you're like within the spheres of, I think there's a version of that that's defensible, but like dialectical materialism, as meant by people who really love that phrase, is like, I don't know. I mean, it really is like this. It's like, here are some like first principles about how all of reality work that like just
and work from there.
Just happened to coincide with like, what like a couple, what some 19th century philosophers thought, which is an amazing coincidence that's all of reality conforms to that, right? That like
conforms to the thoughts of 19th century philosophers. Oh yeah, so I did want to bring something up, by the way, while we're stopped. This is a very, very minor point, but like the MS Paint drawing did him no favors at the beginning of this. I want to focus on the argument, but like if you're going to be in a debate and you want to show something from your screen, do some PowerPoint, get it arranged ahead of time. I think one of our commenters were like, what are those like predator language scribbles? So just, presentation is quite important if you're trying to persuade someone through debates. So put a little more effort into persuasion into persuasion there and presentation, Walter.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know. I mean, like in a weird way, I found it almost charming, although also, the lines looked a little odd, but but I mean, if nothing, if nothing else, I mean, I've drawn that exact 4-box thing enough times on whiteboards. It's like, oh yeah, there's that thing. I mean, I haven't put praxeology in it, but yeah, he's getting that. As somebody pointed out in the comments, this is Kant's distinction. So Kant, makes these two distinctions, a priori and a posteriori, which are distinctions about knowledge. So knowing something a priori means that you know it just by thinking about it, and knowing something a posteriori means that you know it by like checking out in the world to see if it's true. And so roughly everybody, I mean, not Quine, but whatever, like in sort of history of philosophy, Kant to Quine, roughly everybody thinks that there are analytic truths that you can know a priori. So, all bachelors are unmarried is an analytic truth, meaning that it's true just it's made true just by like the definitions of the words, which is so that's what analytic means, and a priori means that you can find out that that's true just by like logic chopping the definitions. You don't need to go out into the world and like do a study where you talk to all the bachelors and see if they're married or not. You don't have to check because it's made true just by the meanings of the words and logic. So Yeah.
Which I will point out, though, as far as like obviously, yes, all bachelors are married, but you notice that argument relies upon two, like the mental concept and legal concept of marriage. So you can know something about like human society a priori, but I don't know if you could necessarily know anything about the actual material world a priori.
Well, I mean, you can't even know it. I mean, you can't even know the claim about human society a priori. In other words, like, you know that all bachelors are unmarried, but you don't know that you don't know if marriage exists.
Yeah.
Right? Like, to find out that marriage exists, that's a claim about the world. You have to go out and check.
Mm-hmm.
Like, but just like, yeah, if anybody anywhere, like if there is such a thing as marriage and there are, adult males who aren't participating in it, then
then obviously
then they're not participating in it, right? That's like,
and we attach this label to them, and then therefore, this label means that.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, it doesn't like, but part of the point about these being analytic truths is that if, like, whatever what's the thing, the Cambrian, like, whatever, if like there was some like evolutionary other turn and neither humans nor any other conscious creatures had ever come into existence, it would nevertheless be true. Nobody would know it, but it'd be true that all bachelors, are unmarried because that's a completely vacuous, like, that's just a claim about how the status of being a bachelor relates to the status of being married.
Mm-hmm.
But like, that's just like saying like, or like everything that's, everything that there are, three of, there's more than two of, and, even in a world where there were only two things, that would still be true, right? So that's so those are definitely things you can figure out a priori. Everybody agrees on that, like Walter said. The much more interesting and contested claim is the synthetic a priori, that there are things that you can know. There are things that are like meaningful claims about reality, right? That there are things you could figure out just by thinking about them without going out and checking, that actually tell you something about how reality is. So like a classic version of that would be like, if you read like Descartes, like, and he'll, or, whatever, various people like that, right? They'll make arguments for the existence of God that are just purely based on thinking about it, that they don't appeal to any empirical facts. Like the ontological argument for the existence of God is like the ultimate, synthetic a priori claim, right? That you can just from thinking hard enough about it, you can figure out that there's a God. And the same way that that's obviously bullshit, then so is this that he's talking about, right?
Spoiler, Ben.
Because of course, it's whether or not rent control, has the consequences that he says it is an empirical question. You can't, of course you can't solve that a priori. That's insane. Like that's, I mean, like what you end up doing when you try to do this, like praxeology, it's like, oh, this is the a priori logical science of human action, is you end up coming up with vaguely plausible sounding claims about how people act. And even those claims, I mean, there is a hidden appeal to empirical evidence, right? I mean, you only believe them because they conform in some way to some experience, like what you've kind of gleaned from experience and observation. But like, yeah, and the trick is, and I mean, this is the problem too with a lot of the, like the sort of internet Marxist, dialectical materialism is a theory of life, the universe, and everything stuff. That's like, yeah, it's not hard to come up with generalizations that sound plausibly true. Yeah, sure. It's like, yeah, that could be right. That sounds kind of right, but it's like, it's not hard to come up with incompatible things that both sound kind of right. And, actual reality being incredibly complicated, like which ones of these is going to be relevant to describing anything that like is actually tells you what's going to happen in history in the, materials case, or like, how rent control is going to play out, right? In this case, is
having lived in Harlem for 10 years, I know how rent control played out, and it was completely overwhelmed by Bloomberg turning New York into a playground for billionaires to hide assets.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like it's, forget morality, forget politics for a second. I mean, just in terms of like how reality and especially how human behavior works, I think we should all kind of get that it's, I don't want to do the thing that like certain YouTube streamers I could mention do where they, it's incredibly complicated, right? But like it is really complicated, and like people act on all sorts of motives in ways that interact with like all kinds of like, there are a bunch of different factors that lead to things happening or not happening when large groups of people interact with each other in complicated ways. And the idea that you could come up with like, here are my, my 10 first principles of praxeology, and then like all I have to do is deduce,
from all of these, yeah. Well, yeah. Well, and even like, so I don't want to do that thing where like we, instead of critiquing the debate, we try to have a debate with the people that can't answer us. But like just to, before we move on, like just a great example, like the action axiom, like the thing that praxeology is based on, the first axiom is Rothbard he defines it essentially as the primordial fact that mankind acts purposefully as opposed to reflexively. And you listen to that, you think it makes sense to it's a very intuitive argument that you can listen to it, think about it, and be like, oh yeah, that seems true. But if you actually pay attention to it, and what you realize very quickly is that the distinction between purposeful action and purposeless action is an entirely subjective distinction. Whereas Rothbard has accidentally began thinking of essentially like purpose as a feature of objective reality, as opposed to, just something in his mind. So ultimately what Rothbard's saying at the very first axiom is mankind acts in a way that I personally think is purposeful, which, yeah, okay, sure. But what exactly have you said with that?
Well, and it's also weird because it's like, I mean, the obvious interpretation of people act purposefully, like, would just get you like, yeah, sometimes to some extent, right? I mean, like, because I mean, anything that like learned from like the last like 100 years of psychology and cognitive science, like it, yeah. I mean, there's a lot going on under the hood that influences human action, that we're not like consciously aware of at any given moment. I mean, of course there is.
Yeah. Well, anyway, we should probably move on because we got this whole debate to get through, and we're 8 minutes in.
No, I know, but the thing I do just want to say, it's a really bad advertisement for praxeology that his stated motive at the beginning of the statement is that he was trying to empirically study the effects of rent control, and sometimes he got the wrong answer, from which he concluded I guess maybe this isn't, as straightforward as I thought it was. Maybe rent control does not lead to these bad effects. But instead, his conclusion was like, oh, clearly what I'm doing wrong here is trying to derive my economic conclusions from like actually empirically studying what happens in the world. Now I see my mistake, right? I should just like be like the, see no evil, hear no evil monkeys, and like just think really hard about praxeology and derive my conclusion about rent control from that. Anyway, all right.
There was something I was going to say, but oh no, this was it. But right before we move on, I wanted to bring up. So he quotes. He's like, Hayek wouldn't agree with me, but Rothbard and von Mises would. And out of those three men, one is a Nobel Prize winner. And it's the one that disagrees with him. So, Walter, I'm sorry, not a good example to use.
Yeah, no, that is weird, right? Because, like, I mean, even aside from the Nobel Prize thing, it's like, which of these three guys is someone who people who disagree with them are likely to like bring up in like a respectful way, like, okay, he, has kind of an interesting argument about this. It's the one who disagrees with him about this. Like, like Hayek, I mean, obviously I find, I find all of his, central conclusions abhorrent, right? And by the way, very very into Pinochet and Salazar before that. Very very bad hombre, but again, like a much more serious thinker than I mean.
Yeah, then Rothbard and like the only reason anyone knows who Ludwig von Mises is Rothbard, and Rothbard couldn't even get he did eventually get von Mises a job at NYU, but it was like a volunteer position where they paid him nothing, and that was like with Rothbard trying his hardest to get him out of there. So yeah, I mean, you if we're contrasting those three, you've got you got von Mises, who's barely an economist, more of a pundit. That's what my friend who studies economics and is a PhD in it mentioned on reading von Mises. And then you've got Rothbard, who is this kind
purely
of
a pundit. I mean, that's like just unabashedly a pundit.
Yeah. And then you have Hayek, who's, we may disagree with him, but he's a real economist.
Yeah. No, exactly. Yeah. Yep. Okay, let's keep watching.
That shirt more than $50, and let's say I value it at $60, so I'm making a profit. And David values it less than $50, otherwise he's not giving it to me. So let's say he values it at 35, so he's making 15 profit. Now it might not be that that I really want the shirt. It might be that I'm trying to butter him up so that he'll go easy on me in his contribution. And that's why I want the shirt. We don't know why I want the shirt. All we know is there's something about that shirt because I'm willing to put $50 on the barrelhead and get that shirt from him. And I think that this is necessarily true, and it tells us something about the real world. Another one is whenever exchange is not voluntary but coerced, one party benefits at the expense of the other. Law of marginal utility, it's downward sloping. The extra, anytime you get an extra thing, you value it less than before. David has 3 bottles of water. The first one he drinks, the second one he washes himself, the third one he does the lawn. I steal the one that he's going to drink. Does he not drink anymore? No, he drinks. He just doesn't do his lawn because that's the third best option for him. Another one is demand curves are downward sloping. I think this is necessarily true, and I don't go along with any of what's that Giffen good crap. That's all wrong. They're all downward sloping. Then there's the Ricardian law of association. If two producers, if A is more productive and productive of 2 types of goods than is B, they can still engage in mutually beneficial exchange. Another one is minimum wage laws are enforced. Whenever minimum wage laws are enforced that require wages to be higher than existing market wages, involuntary unemployment will be higher than it otherwise would have been. This is untestable because we don't know what it otherwise would have been. And yet it tells us something about the world. And yet it's impossible to deny. Whenever the quantity of money is increased, while the demand for money is to be held as cash reserve is unchanged, the purchasing power of money will fall. Another one, rent control leads to lousy housing, more shortages than otherwise, less supply than otherwise, less repair than otherwise. But we don't know what otherwise would have happened. So it's, again, untestable, and yet it tells us something about the real world. Occupational licensure, restricted entry harms consumers. Milton Friedman, in his book, Capitalism and Freedom, one of my favorite chapters, chapter 9, where he talks about occupational licensure for doctors. Brilliant chapter. This harms consumers. Everything bought by one person has to be sold by another. It sounds trite, but I don't think it's a tautology because I think it tells us something about the real world. Okay, so those are a bunch of economic examples of synthetic a priori statements. And again, what a synthetic a priori is true, necessarily true, undeniable, axiomatic, and yet it tells us something about the real world, something I think David would deny. Now for some non-economic examples of synthetic a priori statements. Pythagorean theorem. what do you call it? The square of the hypotenuse equals the square of the sum of the sides of the triangle. Can't test that. Parallel lines cannot cross. Nothing. Another one is nothing can be simultaneously red and green all over. Necessarily true. You don't have to test this. You can't test this. The idea of testing it is silly, and yet it tells us something about the real world. The shortest path between 2 points is a straight line. Descartes, I think, therefore I am. Man acts. What human action starts with Mises's book, Human Action. Any attempt to deny it will still be an action. So you can't get around that. Only a living world can include death. Triangles have 180 degrees, assuming straight lines. If they're bowed in, then they need not have 180 degrees. An empirically oriented student who tries to measure the triangle is missing the point. This is a matter of logic. And the way Austrianism is, it's not a branch of empirical science like physics or chemistry. It's rather a branch of logic. That's what economics is for the Austrians. All synthetic a priori statements are non-testable, non-falsifiable, can't even think of a rejection, and yet they give us knowledge. Here, consider the following statement. All statements in economics must be falsifiable. This I would attribute to David or to University of Chicago people. This is the logical positivist view. All statements in economics must be falsifiable. Well, what's the status of that statement? Well, is it a tautology, in which case it just tells us how words are being used? Or is it empirical statement, in which case we have to test it? But David never tests anything of the sort. So he's sort of hoisted by his own petard on this. It's self-refutational. It's a logical contradiction. Or try this one. If it can't be falsified by reality, it doesn't really apply to the real world. It tells us nothing about the real world. What's the status of that statement? Again, for David, it's either a tautology or an empirical statement, and it's neither. He's attempting to give an axiomatic synthetic a priori, I think a wrong one, but he's violating his own strictures when confronted with a statement like that. The Chicago and the mainstream, they sound scientific. We rely on empirical evidence to test theories. Austrians just have theories but refuse to test them. So it sounds like Chicagoans are the good guys because the Austrians are just a bunch of, I don't know, wimps or something because we don't want to test things. Well, we're not against econometrics. Econometrics is okay. It's just that you would illustrate things, and sometimes the illustration fails, but you're not going to test any of these theories because they are apodictically true, necessarily true. I believe that that economists make predictions to show they have a sense of humor, because ceteris is never paribus in the real world. Minimum wage, I think minimum wage will create more unemployment than otherwise would have existed. But what happens is Bill Gates wants to disprove us, and he starts hiring people, even though he's going to lose money. Well, how can we, preclude that sort of a thing? Or maybe there's a boom. Well, the econometrics will try to take into account a boom, but they can only do so imperfectly. Card and Kruger come up with a case where the minimum wage doesn't create unemployment, and I think it ought to be laughed out of court. I think those people ought to get their PhDs rescinded or something. Okay, I've now done praxeology. Now what I'm going to do is a whole bunch of other things where Austrians and Chicagoites disagree with each other. First of all, indifference. Indifference is a perfectly good word. I went to the store the other day, I wanted a can of Coca-Cola, and there were 300 of them. And before I picked, I was indifferent between them. I didn't care which can of Coke. They're all the same, homogeneous. But in the action, I picked one of them. Namely, I have no way of demonstrating or illustrating indifference because all human action is setting aside and preferring things. You just can't exemplify indifference. Indifference is a technical economic word. It's sort of like work. In physics, and David is a physicist, a renowned physicist, he'll correct me if I'm wrong on this, but work means mass times distance. But if you're holding two dumbbells, 20-pound dumbbells to the side, and you're not moving, well, then you're not doing any work, and yet you're going to be sweating because you're doing a lot of work. So in physics, you have a technical language and then you have an ordinary language, and it's the same thing here. Difference is a perfectly good word, but as a matter of technical economics, you cannot exemplify it, you cannot demonstrate it. Therefore, all those indifference curves that they're always drawing is problematic. Another one is rationality. If A is bigger than B and B is bigger than C, then A is bigger than C, fine, no problem. But if you prefer A to B, and then you prefer B to C, and then do you necessarily prefer A to C? No, you could have changed your mind because you're making these preferences at 3 different times. And Austrians would find difficulty with that. Chicagoans would not. Ordinal and cardinal utility. Yes, I think we both agree that there is such a thing as ordinal utility. Where David and I would diverge, I think, would be on cardinal utility. He thinks there is also such a thing as cardinal utility. I think there ain't no such thing as a util. And what cardinal utility is a measure of utility. Look, we're not against measurement. We have height, we have weight, we have temperature, 98.6. We have speed, 50 miles an hour. We're not against things like that. But we don't think that there's any such thing as a happiness unit. Okay, another divergence between Austrians and mainstreamers is they believe in market failures. They see market failures all over the place. For example, let me whip up a market failure here. Let me clear the drawings here. Okay, so here's a market failure for you. Whoops, what did I do wrong? Clear all drawings. Okay, here we go. Here is average cost. And I got to make the marginal cost hit the average cost at the bottom of it. Otherwise, I'm a rotten kid. And I should also label my axes. And here is the demand curve. That's supposed to be a straight line, but what the heck? Average revenue. Here is marginal revenue. And here is where the competitor will be. Well, where will the monopolist be? The monopolist will be where marginal revenue hits marginal cost. And what will the price be? The price will be over there. And that's the monopolist, and this is the competitor. And look what we have over here. We have this thing called deadweight loss. Well, deadweight loss is an exercise not only in interpersonal comparisons of utility. David and I both have young grandchildren, and I'm sure he agrees with me on this. When you do with the babies, you go, peekaboo, I see you. Well, here ICU doesn't stand for peekaboo with David has a 2-year-old grandchild. I'm sure he does this. It stands for interpersonal comparison utility. And what we're saying is that the demanders value the product, the area under here, and it only costs here, and yet the evil monopolist is not producing it, and we have to have antitrust. Now, the good Chicagoans, as opposed to the Keynesians, also realize, well, antitrust costs money. So now we have a full employment bill for economists. We have to figure out how big is this and how much does antitrust cost? And if antitrust costs more than the deadweight loss, then don't even have the thing. But I think that the whole problem, that's not the problem. The problem is that this is problematic, that this whole thing is an exercise in interpersonal comparison utility. Now, let me give you another one. This supports the negative income tax, taking money from the rich people and giving it to the poor. Here's money. Here are utils. Notice that we're in cardinal utility, and here is diminishing marginal utility of money. And here is a rich guy who's making 100,000 a year, and we're going to take 1,000 away from him, and he's going to lose that many utils. And here is a poor guy who only has 6,000 a year, and we're going to give him an extra 1,000. Then we're going to take money away from this guy and give it to that guy, and we'll have an accretion of utils of this amount because this guy values the dollars more than that guy. Now, I think that this is highly problematic because it's cardinal utility, and not only is it cardinal utility, but it's also interpersonal comparison utility. And yet the Chicagoans all go for this. This is the justification of welfare or the negative income tax. One way to refute this is the Austrian way. Another way to refute is to say, well, who says that they're all on the same curve? Maybe this is the poor curve, and this is the rich guy. And when we take money away from the rich guy, we're taking that much utils. So therefore, we're losing this a little amount of utils. But the whole thing is silly. There ain't no utils. And I think the Chicago school stands or falls with regard to utils. What else have we got? We got public goods, excludability, and rivalrousness. They believe that, I don't know, let me see, what am I doing here? Oh, yeah. They believe that there is such a thing as a public good. Because if it's non-excludable and non-rivalrousness, like the lighthouse and defense, then it's a market failure. Now, David is an anarcho-capitalist, so I know he's not favoring government doing any of this stuff. But most Chicagoans are not anarcho-capitalists, and most Chicagoans of whatever school, UCLA, Columbia, Chicago, wherever, would favor government having lighthouses before GPS and national defense. And so that's another divergence between Austrians and mainstreamers and Chicagoans. Then there's externalities. Let me get back to the screen to do a little bit on externalities. Come on, screen share. Where are we? Here we go. Get rid of that. And what do we have? Here we have the supply and demand of education. That's the quantity of education, and that's the price of education. And this is the amount of the quantity of education that will be in equilibrium. However, and here Milton Friedman says this in his book, Capitalism and Freedom. I don't mean to pick on him. I'm not picking on David's dad, but virtually all Chicagoans would agree with this. They would say, look, this demand curve is just private benefits. But what we really should do is think of the sum of private plus public benefits. And when we get that, we get a different demand curve. And this should be the quantity. So this is the quantity of equilibrium, or the actual quantity that the market will come up with. But this is the ideal quantity. We should have more education, and therefore we have to have a subsidy for education, whether you give a subsidy to students or the teachers or something. Well, this is just this is very, very highly problematic. I would say that because you see, the private part, this demand curve for the private, that's okay. That's cash on the barrelhead. People are paying money and buying education. Fine. But this other stuff is just hypothetical, and they just make it up out of whole cloth. They're a bunch of, dare I say, socialists, and I don't think David falls under this rubric, but many Chicagoans do. They're a bunch of socialists here. And, I can easily do the opposite. I can say, look, most education, at least that I'm familiar with, consists of sociology and queer studies and feminist studies and Black studies. And what it really is not an external economy. This is an external economy, but an external diseconomy. So here's the external diseconomy thing, and here's supply and there's demand. Now, the usual case of external diseconomy is not education, it's rather pollution. And what we say, well, here is the private cost, but then there's smoke and other stuff. So this would be the actual amount of some product, the quantity actual, and this would be the quantity ideal. And therefore, we have to move in this direction with pollution. And I'm saying I could do that with education. I mean, anyone can draw stupid lines on a blackboard. So Austrians diverge very much from Chicagoans there as well. Okay, now let me get to Ronald Coase. Ronald Coase is highly problematic. What does Ronald Coase do? He says, well, there are two states of the world. First, there's a zero transactions cost world. What is transactions cost? Well, remember I was buying the shirt from David. That was just the shirt, but there are all sorts of transactions. He has to mail the shirt to me, and he has to insure it, and there are all sorts of transactions that are involved with buying a shirt. And Coase says that if in a zero transactions cost world, now look, I'm not going to buy that shirt from David, but I claim that that's my shirt. David stole it from me yesterday. That's my shirt, and I'm suing him for it. And what Coase says is that it doesn't matter whether the judge favors me or David. If that shirt will end up in the same hands. Now, look, suppose I value that shirt at $500. I really love that shirt, and David only values it at $20. Well, if the judge gives me the shirt, will David be able to bribe me out of it? No, he's got to pay me more than $500, and he only values it at $20. On the other hand, if the judge gives him the shirt, I can bribe him out of it because he only values it at 20 and I'll pay him 300 and we'll both make a profit. So Coase in the zero transaction cost world says, well, it doesn't matter what the judge says, the more valued person will get it. And if I get it, the GDP will rise. And his shtick is to raise the GDP. One of my very first articles, one of my very first refereed articles was saying that Coase is wrong because just because I value it at 50 doesn't mean I have money. And he never said that I had to have money. I have 300 to bribe David. And then I got into a big hassle with Harold Demsetz, who was another Chicagoan. And Harold and I went back and forth on whether I was right or wrong on the fact that Coase left this out, which was a technical, very narrow technical thing, which is a minor difficulty that I have with Coase. The major difficulty I have with Coase is, in the real world, what is Coase's advice to the judge? Should he give it to me or should he give it to David? And the answer is he should give it to me because he wanted to increase the GDP. Remember, I valued it at 500. David only values it at $20. And the Coasean judge should give it to me. Well, now we have Coase as a central planner. Only the judge is a central planner. How the hell does the judge know how much I value it at? I say I value it at 500. David could say he values it at 600. I mean, there's no rhyme or reason. Compared to how an ordinary judge would rule on this. The ordinary judge would go, he would say, possession is 9/10 of the law. David owns that shirt. He's wearing the shirt. The burden of proof is on me. I have to prove that I bought the shirt. I never saw the shirt before. David's got a bill of sale for the shirt, or his son bought it for him, or something. The son has a bill of sale, and the judge.
All right, I'm just going to stop this. I kind of thought that he was going to stop talking a long time before this, so I was like, okay, I'll just do the opening statement, and then we'll pause and we'll talk about it. But this is like,
oh my god,
we're almost half an hour in, and he shows no sign of slowing down. So we should pause to stop and talk about some of this. A lot of stuff happened since the last time we paused, but one thing that I do want to point out here, it's a very small point, but he's talking about education, and he says that education is mostly sociology and queer studies and black studies. I think that's what he said.
Yeah. Yes, he did.
Okay. So I looked this up. At some point after he said that, I Googled this, and here's a list of the most popular majors by number of degrees awarded. Number 1 is business and management. Number 2 is nursing, psychology, biology, engineering, education, communications. Okay, that one's bullshit. I'll give him that. Finance and accounting, criminal justice, anthropology. Okay, anthropology and sociology. They're clumping those together. So I guess that's coming in number 10. Computer science, English, economics, political science, history, physical therapy. I think this list goes down to 44, and I just want to briefly show that I don't see queer studies on here. It seems to me that if by far the most popular major is business and management. So I think that Walter's information about what goes on in college, this is like this is the least of what was wrong with what we just watched, but want to point that out.
No, it's there. I mean, this is very much Grandpa Simpson, old man yells at cloud. Like, I'm genuine. I had a lot of trouble following his points. And I think part of it was that he was using a lot of very hyper-specific jargon that may have made sense to him and David, and maybe like the nerdiest of the nerdy viewers. But like, I don't think your average watcher, even if they're the kind of watcher who's going to be watching a debate between an anarcho-capitalist and a Austrian school, like if you're talking about stuff that is so divorced, you're not communicating. And so I feel like it was very, very difficult to follow a single clear thread because he jumped around so much. There's a few things that I noticed also. So he says that red and green, like red and green are never going to be the same thing. Color is the experience of color is qualia. And like red and green are the same to a colorblind person. There are cultures where certain, like if you're raised in that culture, you can't tell the difference between blue and green. So color is something that is created in our mind as a result of light interacting with our eyes. He's using.
Well, I mean,
Yeah.
if it's the, I mean, okay, so there are surprisingly complicated debates that happen about how to think about what a color is. And one view is it's like something like a quality in something that disposes it to be seen as that color, seen in the right conditions or whatever. And it is, true, I guess, that nothing could, I mean, this is a classic example of something that you're supposed to be able to tell a priori, although also people who use it generally think that it goes in the MS Paint drawing, and Janos's thing made me laugh there. What is this? Scrawling shit on MS Paint. That's the way you're supposed to tell what's true about reality, is to, do some, but usually people who use that example about nothing but red and green all over think that's a analytic truth, right? I mean, I've never heard any, like, because it's weird too, because it's like, it's not like, I don't like, that's, so he says the reason he was listing this off, and I know a lot of people looking at the chat were confused by this, is that there was a point where he just starts like throwing out like 100 things in 5 minutes that he thinks, and I know it's easy to have your eyes kind of glaze over. You're like, wait a second, why are we, like is he having a stroke? Like, why are we like jumping around between these, it all kind of comes with this verbal glot. But like what he was doing in context was he was saying all of these are things that, that we could figure out a priori. We don't need evidence. We could just scroll stuff on MS Paint, right? And think about it. That these are all things that we can know a priori. We can know just by pure thought without evidence, but they all tell us something about reality. So he
never specifies exactly what some of these things tell him about reality.
No, and like in the case of like the nothing could be red and green all over. I mean, I actually agree.
If you're colorblind, they're red and green are the same. If it's that particular kind of colorblindness. I'm sorry. What were you saying?
I mean, maybe what you mean by red is that it's going to appear red under the right conditions to someone whose eyes work the right way or whatever, And like, it's. I mean, first of all, it's not clear how much this does tell you about reality, because you might think that, you might think it's just like a matter of, I don't know. I mean, we haven't said yet whether there are any red things or any green things. We just said if there are, that they're not the same things, But also, I don't know. I mean, I mean, maybe your point about color blindness, I mean, like, it's. I mean if the part of the problem, I mean, and I don't want to beat up on Walter Block too much for this, because like this is like a really like classic example that tons of people use, and like it, and
so it's not just him being a weirdo.
No, this isn't him being weird. I mean, this is a very common example of something that we're supposed to, like know a priori or whatever. But like, I'm not sure how great an example it is, because it seems like it really depends on what you think colors are, which I know sounds dumb, because it's like, like it that just sounds like, I know what a color is, but like do like a 200-word explanation. It's more, it's weirder and it's harder to say what than you think it is. But like if whatever, depending on what you think that ultimately means, right? Or are you like, if this is ultimately a claim about, like you said earlier, qualia, right? How things appear, right? Then like, is this even a priori, or is this just like an appeal to like, how, you nothing appears both of these ways to you at the same time? Like
it's an appeal to common sense, essentially. He's doing an appeal to common sense. It just sounds like it might be more.
Yeah. But like, forget that example for a second. Like, the really amazing thing about that list is that when he was listing off all the things that we can tell a priori, and I mean, this is really like, this is pretty bad, right? Like I think it's a good analogy, but like, I think he might not, like, if you thought about it a little bit more, Some of the things he was listed off that he claims are synthetic a priori truths, are things that we could figure out they're true just by thinking about them, but they tell us something about how reality is. In that list of those, like a few of them were just like axioms of Euclidean geometry. And for anybody who needs a refresher on this, the like relativistic physics is based on non-Euclidean geometry, in which some of those axioms don't hold true. So, like,
well, it's not just that. Like, all of construction is non-Euclidean geometry because the Earth is curved; it's round. So, like, yeah, it's
like but like the actual like mathematical modeling, you know, of like Einsteinian space-time is based on non-Euclidean geometry, and so, which is also one of the reasons, like I think Andrea said in the chat, you know, that seems to be confusing axioms and theorems. I mean, like, again, this idea that, I mean, Kant agreed with him, you know, to be fair, he's in good company. You know, Kant thought that mathematical truths were synthetic a priori truths. Of course, Kant had a better excuse for not knowing about the geometry of space-time, you know, that's, but like also lots of people since Kant have thought that actually no, mathematical truths are ultimately some kind of analytic truths that, like, maybe, like, because especially if you start thinking about examples like the one about geometry and say, okay, sure, but there is some sense in which you know, in which like all the things that you could derive from those Euclidean axioms are true, right? It's like, sure, but like a perfectly respectable view of what's going on there is that it's like mathematical truths always have some kind of disguised, like, according to the axioms component to them, right? You know, that it's like, you know, according to the axioms of, you know, of Euclidean geometry, such is true, right? According to the axioms of whatever alternative non-Euclidean geometry, something else is true, which is, by the way, this is, anybody remembers this, like several months back, James Lindsay was making this big deal on Twitter about people not wanting to acknowledge that, people saying that it was possible that, like, basic arithmetic statements weren't true. So, you know, it's like, you know, 2 + 3 = 5, damn it, right? You know, it's like, yeah, sure. Yeah. Like, given the axioms of classical arithmetic, then yes, right? And those are the ones that, you know, describe what happens in our world, right? You know, but like, that's an empirical fact, you know, and it's like that, like, in other words, like, again, I don't want to say like I'm definitely married to any particular view about how we should think about mathematical truths. I mean, it's not something I spend a lot of time thinking about, but like, at least one popular and reasonable view of how we should think about them is that ultimately it's always like relative to some set of axioms. And if so, in other words, the math itself, like the mathematical claim itself, no, does not tell you anything about reality. You need the sort of further premise that, like, the physical reality is such that its structure matches up with some set of mathematical axioms, but that, unfortunately, you actually do need to check. And like, sometimes it turns out that you're wrong about it.
Well, it's, you know, a lot of this stuff, the proof in it is, what does it allow us to do in reality? Like, what can you do with various types of geometry and mathematics? You know, can you calculate, you know, a rocket to the moon or whatever? Then, okay, then it's correct, at least as far as calculating the rocket to the moon. But yeah, it seems a little bit like the judge and the advocate are the same person when you're kind of saying that a statement agrees with itself, essentially, you know. There were a couple of other things I wanted to bring up. Now we've got, I felt like he was throwing out a lot of just completely unsupported assertions. And again, it seems like a lot of times he's appealing to common sense, but I think you kind of need to be a little bit more rigorous about that. And especially you need to draw that out. Also, I've noticed he's doing this. where he's getting really low and he's choking off, and I can't quite tell, but it almost looks like his breath is fogging his microphone or his camera a little bit. Guys, when you are debating, you want to be able to be seen, but two, if you lean forward and you choke off your airway, your voice gets weaker. People are not going to respond to that as much. So, like, again, from a performance standpoint, I'm giving that a D.
Yeah. So also, like, again, all of this started with him saying, oh, when I was trying to empirically study the effects of rent control, sometimes it didn't, sometimes what I found didn't entirely match up my libertarian dogma. And therefore, we shouldn't empirically study this stuff because, like, then, we might end up with data that contradicts our premises and is therefore wrong, which is, kind of an amazing way to start. But then, like, he, utiles, by the way, are units of happiness, but, like, whatever, I'm not sure that matters that much. Just like anybody who sort of saw that going by was like, what the fuck is he talking about? I don't understand what's going on. That's what was going on there.
I didn't know what a utile was before that, but hearing that, I was like, there's got to be a unit of happiness. There's no comparison.
Yeah. So like utilitarian, like, philosophy, like, sometimes you'll illustrate it by saying, like, oh, decision A gives this person such and such many utiles, and he pronounced it weird, but whatever, and decision B gives it that much, then, what would the right thing to do be? And it is obviously a huge oversimplification because, like, I'm not a utilitarian, but utilitarians aren't idiots. They understand, like, they don't actually think you can literally quantify happiness.
Yeah.
Nobody thinks that, but it's like a useful illustration for some purposes. But also, I think on the more important part,
that was what we meant by utils. I was completely lost there.
Yeah. There you go. Yep. I don't think it actually mattered that much for his argument, but maybe I missed something there. But also it's okay. So he says, and also, like, the big argument that I heard in the last, like, 20 minutes or whatever that he was talking since the last time we paused, the big argument I heard against Chicago school economics is that if you believe Chicago school economics, then you can't rule out the possibility of market failures, that like, sometimes the market will produce results that might need to be corrected with government intervention. This is obviously a heresy, so therefore Chicago school economics must be wrong. And Austrian school economics, which, like, rules this out more securely, must be right.
He called David D. Friedman a socialist.
So, David Friedman, who said his preferred model is competitive dictatorships. Oh
my god.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah. So Chicago school is bad because you end up with this socialist stuff, like thinking that sometimes some government regulation might actually serve a good purpose. Like, that was his major argument against it. And his big argument for thinking that we can do praxeology, that, in other words, we can extrapolate claims about how economies work from just pure thought with no evidence whatsoever having to be introduced. Like, that's what his argument here. Anybody missed the point, right? Like, one of his big arguments here was that, well, clearly we all know that minimum wage increases increase unemployment, but that's untestable because we say that if there's a minimum wage increase, there's more unemployment than there would be otherwise. And how could we possibly know what the otherwise was? Which is funny because he also multiple times referenced Card and Kruger, which is this classic minimum wage study that, in fact, does find the direct otherwise, right? So in 1992, these two economists, Card and Kruger, they, right before this minimum wage increase went into effect in New Jersey, they looked at restaurant employment there because, and, like, fast food employment, like, in other words, exactly the thing that people always bring up, where there's supposed to be unemployment with minimum wage increases. And it's also perfect because it's New Jersey, because I think there was like a bordering town in Pennsylvania where the minimum wage increase hadn't happened. So, like, like there are multiple ways in which you can compare the two. And now if any libertarians are watching right now, that they always like you bring up like any minimum wage study ever, and they always have like 200 methodological objections, and here's why this doesn't actually show, what it's supposed to show. And you can fight them on that. Lots of people do. I actually think most studies, and especially meta studies, where you pool together the results of a bunch of studies, show that there aren't significant employment effects of minimum wage increases. But like, I think the more important point, like take a step back from like lawyering the details of the studies, be like, okay, if some super subtle methodological problems invalidate this whole thing, then man, this effect must not be that big, right? I mean, like if it's that easy to miss it, right? If you don't construct it exactly right, then like this doesn't sound like a particularly catastrophic effect. And also, it's crazy to think that like, do the like standard libertarian thing where you say, well, there might be more unemployment, therefore it's a net negative for the working poor, which is an insane inference, right? Because it's like if you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, and so you've raised the wages of tens of millions of people, and let's say a couple of million lose their jobs, like as a result, for the sake of argument. Like the idea that, oh, clearly this was more bad than good for the people it's supposed to help is insane, right? I mean, that's that doesn't, like, that's ridiculous. Like even aside from the fact that we could have federal, jobs guarantees, federal work programs, whatever, to like pick up the slack, that they, could come up with a long list of things that there are for like a couple million people to do if they need new jobs in the public sector. But like, even aside from that, even if there was going to be like nothing, like no increase in unemployment benefits, anything, right? Like the idea that a couple of million people going from a job they couldn't really support themselves onto unemployment benefits is more bad than tens of millions of people being lifted out of poverty is good is just psychotic.
Yeah. And they always seem to forget that when you raise the minimum wage, people have more money. And it's the people who are at the lower end of the economic spectrum, which means they're definitely going to spend it, which means business increases, which means higher profits, most likely, is, all other things being equal. So like, it's an example of like them trying to think about these things in a very, very limited way that just doesn't take into account all applicable data. Because they're starting with their conclusion and trying to suss that out logically rather than doing the thing of, rather than
going out and checking. Yeah. Well, especially because, okay, so we all know the sort of supply and demand argument that increase the minimum wage is going to increase unemployment. There's a really simplified version of that Walter Block just, kind of gave and said, oh, praxeology shows us this. Well, no, but I mean, like some like initially plausible sounding generalizations about supply and demand show you this, until you remember that not all demand is equally elastic. And, and so there are some things that we're going to like, there's some things where the slightest little change in the supply, right, is going to influence demand a lot. And there's some things where it really won't, right? Like if I have this is one of the problems with private healthcare, right? If I need a heart transplant, even if we have total price transparency, like Charlie Kirk said, like whatever, so like while I'm on my way for the ambulance to the hospital, they tell me exactly what the transplant's going to cost me. I'm not going to say, hold off on that while I shop around, right? Like that's, like
please take me to the hospital, save my life.
yeah. It's extremely inelastic. And demand for labor isn't that inelastic, but it's also a lot more, it's also a lot less elastic than a lot of other, than like the sort of typical things that we're thinking about when we think about like really simple Econ 101 kind of supply and demand problems. But like whatever, ignore all that. Say, yeah, okay, we've got our a priori argument that minimum wage increases are going to increase unemployment. But hey, guess what? The argument you just gave, which is a roughly Keynesian-ish argument, for saying that it's actually going to stimulate more economic growth, whatever, like that is also something that you could extrapolate from some plausible sounding generalizations. And, like, hey, if instead of reading Rothbard, you read, the general theory of markets and money, and like you derived your plausible sounding generalizations from that, then you would extrapolate it and come up with the opposite result. which is exactly why it's so ridiculous to think that you can like find out what's true about any of this stuff, you know, just by like thinking really hard, and that you don't actually have to look at the evidence.
Well, I feel like, you know, one of the reasons we have the empirical, like the scientific method, one of the reasons we do it is because people are very biased, and we're really bad at like evaluating what is true when it's, you know, when it conflicts with our biases. So like, you know, you have a method where you can go out and you can test something and find out objectively, or as objectively as possible, whether you're right or wrong. And it seems like they just want to throw that out because they don't want their biases to ever be questioned. So I did not want this to pass without bringing this up, though. Who in the world insures a shirt? like it's talking about like the $50, and I know he's doing it as an example. So like this is not so much a point against the example he's trying to draw, but like, when you were going to make an example in a debate, don't make an example that is so incredibly off the wall that it just makes everybody stop and start thinking about who is insuring shirts and selling them for $500.
Yeah, it's like the right. I mean, it's like a very, very mild version of the problem when like people who debate a lot on YouTube want to make every example about Nazis or pedophiles. You know, it's like, yeah, but like if the example is calling that much attention to itself, you know, you're kind of distracted from like whatever you're originally supposed to be talking about. You know, it's like, wait a second, now I'm just thinking about the Nazi pedophiles. Like, what were we arguing about? Oh yeah, right, economics. You know, like yeah, but I don't know. Walter Block really likes examples about buying or stealing people's shirts. I don't know what's up with that, but there you go.
Maybe he's just cold. So how much longer is this guy going to go on? What do we
yeah, I guess we will find out. Let's see.
I have to mention Sherwin Rosen. Sherwin Rosen wrote, another Chicagoan, the University of Chicago this time, and he wrote this article, "Is there any hope for reconciliation between Austrians and Chicagoans? Is there anything we can learn from each other?" And his answer was no. Why? Because there are more Chicagoans than Austrians. That's what he said. And I wrote an article, and what I tried was a reductio ad absurdum. The reductio ad absurdum was, he who, publishes last wins the debate. So by the way, I'm going to win this debate because I'm scheduled to go last. So according to this reductio ad absurdum, I've got to win this debate because I'm going last, and he who publishes last wins. Well, it's obviously silly because, you know, I might attack David and he doesn't even think that my response is worthwhile. So I publish last. Doesn't mean that I'm right, but what it was an attempt to have a reductio ad absurdum against Sherwin Rosen. Let me talk a little bit more about mathematics. For the Austrians, the dog is economics and the tail is mathematics. My claim for the Chicagoans and the mainstream is it's the opposite way around. Economics has to fit into mathematics. The mathematicians love smooth curves. Why? Because you can differentiate and integrate stuff with smooth curves, where if you have jagged curves, you can't do that. Well, human action is discrete. It's not smooth. We can't engage in infinitesimally different amounts of things. You know, you buy a quart of milk, you don't buy 1/1,000,000th of a drop of milk or anything like that. So smooth curves are something that I think comes from math, not from economics. We spoke about ordinal and cardinal. Now there are these guys, von Neumann and Morgenstern, and what they do is they concoct some sort of rigmarole where they take uncertainty and they let's suppose that we're talking about ordinal utility, and I like apples better than bananas and bananas better than carrots, and we give apples a 3 and bananas a 2 and carrots a 1. And now what we do is we concoct some sort of thing. Well, suppose we have a 60% chance of a carrot and a 20% chance of a banana and a 20% chance of a carrot. Which would you prefer, that or 33, 33, and 33? And out of that, they come up with a number. And they think that this is a cardinal number. No, it's not a cardinal number. It's not. Ordinal number is first, second, third. Cardinal number is 1, 2, 3. Well, this is a 1, 2, 3, but it's still not a cardinal number, because for it to be a cardinal number, you have to have units, and we don't have units of happiness. I mean, here are some reductio ad absurdums of the von Neumann Morgenstern. Girl A is the prettiest, girl B is the second prettiest, and girl C is the third prettiest. And now we can come up with a cardinal measurement of prettiness. Or my favorite composers in order are Mozart, Bach, Handel, Vivaldi, and Beethoven. And now I can concoct musical, I don't know, cardinality in music, which
That's
is
30
great.
minutes.
My time is up. Well, just one last one for 30 seconds. My favorite 3 comedians are Dave Chappelle, Mr. Bean, and John Cleese of Fawlty Towers. And now we can have funniness units. The whole thing is crazy. Thanks for your attention.
Thank you.
What the hell was that last point even supposed to mean?
So I think I'm not confident about this because he wasn't being very clear. But you know, I mean, I understand. You know, he's presenting this for people who are, you know, who are really into these debates, and so he's not, you know. But like, I think even in that context, you got to explain things a little bit more than this. But from what I could tell, I think that his point is that I think he's saying that Chicago school economists want to go from saying that you can rank things, you know, that like B is better for you than A and C is better for you than, you know, than B, so C is better for you than A, to say that we can like represent them in like units of each one. And he's saying that that's wrong. I think that's it. And I don't think that much of anything is actually going to hinge on that. I think he's making like way too big a deal about it. Is my strong suspicion about that. But I did just want to say, he brought up logical positivism again, which I meant to say earlier, that you know, like he's doing this really weird false dichotomy, where it's like either you believe that, you know, there are synthetic a priori truths, and you know, we could, and like, not only are there synthetic a priori truths, but like there's synthetic a priori truths about economics, or you're a logical positivist, and that's silly, right? I mean, logical positivism is a view that is held by extremely few people in the world, you know, right now, and you certainly don't have to be a logical positivist to not think that we can like, that there's like a branch of logic that allows us to, you know, that allows us to predict exactly how complex economies are going to work and how policy choices are going to play out without having to look at any kind of empirical evidence like that. That's like, I mean, that's just deeply strange, right? Like, so like the actual logical positivists were these people, like the, you know, the Vienna Circle and A.J. Ayer in England, who, you know, were actually kind of cool. Like a lot of them were, you know, socialists and anti-fascists in the 30s, but who thought that you know, like at least a popular version of it, you know, was that everything is either like empirically verifiable or like a tautology, or contradiction, or just meaningless. And which is like a really extreme view, especially as they often interpreted it. So like, that would be like, you know, like the correct position on religion isn't even atheism. It's like, it's just saying, oh, I don't know what you mean. Right. You know, that's like, like that kind of thing. Right. You know, and it led like Ayer to saying that we can't even have like ethical statements can't even be true. They're just kind of like, that, you know, it's just like, you know, all you could possibly be doing is just like expressing your emotions. You know, it's like, you know, he says murder is wrong. It's just a way of saying boo murder. So, so it's a really extreme view, and the space in also Liam Bright is I guess a positivist now. I'm not sure how literally he means it, but and I like him, but the space between like being a logical positivist and believing that praxeology is a thing is like there's so many positions in between those two. It's just amazing. The only other thing I wanted to say is after you said the thing about how maybe it's just cold, I saw somebody point out in one of the chats that was going by that he is wearing 2 layers of shirts, and it made me think of there was a minute when people were trying to make a big deal in the 2020 campaign of Bernie Sanders like being like really like neurotic and like demanding about like exactly how the temperature had to be set in his hotel room, which I remember thinking was pretty funny at the time because it's like, stop the presses, like old Jewish man has very specific sleeping preferences, but like, who would have imagined, right? But like, so, just as a sort of Larry David character in my head, I like the version of Walter Block who's constantly using examples about like getting extra shirts because he's just constantly cold.
Hey, that would make sense of the kind of blur on the camera there. So there was something that he brought up, and I don't remember the name that he threw out there, but the guy who said supposedly Chicagoans can't learn anything from Austrians because there are more Chicagoans than others. There is no way that is true. That is definitely a straw man. I have no idea what they're referring to, but that is such a ridiculous argument to go to. He's got to be misquoting.
Yeah, there's no way anybody's actually saying that.
Yeah. The other big thing here, and this is this happened when it was our debate with Todd Lewis and Keith Preston. Do you remember at the beginning of this debate, Todd opened with this big attack on we were debating
value, right?
Yeah. We were debating, what was it? Can socialism innovate? And he opened with this big attack on the labor theory of value. And you and I just were like, okay, it doesn't have anything to do with what we're talking about, and just went on with the rest of the debate. When you're involved in a debate, guys, don't argue with someone who isn't there. If you're going to commit to something, especially if you're starting, make sure that isn't a case that your opponent is actually going to argue. So, like, even if he was right about this one crazy dude possibly claiming that numbers means we win an argument, like, even if that guy really did do that, he's not arguing with that guy. He's arguing with David D. Friedman.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Like, yeah. Okay. Yep. I think that's a good point. But it has only been I love that he was still going strong when it was like 30 minutes. He was like, oh shit. Okay.
I like Dave Chappelle, therefore I win.
Oh God. And that's such a weird list of comedians. Like forget the point about cardinals, ordinals, whatever, like this like really nitpicky mathematical point he was making. Just like whose favorite comedians are Dave Chappelle, Mr. Bean, and like John. So first of all, 2 of the 3 are just like comedy characters, right? And one is a stand-up. Like that's just weird to start with. But like also just in terms of like style of humor, that's such a weird list of your favorite comedians.
Yeah, because you got Monty Python, except he quoted Fawlty Towers, not Monty Python. You've got Mr. Bean, who doesn't talk in his, and then you got Dave Chappelle, who's a stand-up. I feel like maybe because people are mad at Dave Chappelle right now, he was like maybe just tacking Dave Chappelle there to virtue signal.
I like Dave Chappelle. See, it's like your culture war point, because it's like, I actually do really like Dave Chappelle. Like, I have no problem saying that, right? Like, I was a very, he's a good comedian.
You're canceled, Ben.
But like, it just seems like so weird, because it's like the John Cleese's character in Fawlty Towers and Rowan Atkinson played Mr. Bean. Like, somebody likes both of those. Like, okay, I guess I get the pattern here. But like it's like throwing in Dave Chappelle on that list is just bizarre. It's like my my favorite things are like Dr. Pepper and Sprite and Dr. Pepper and Sprite and single malt Scotch, right? It's like wait a second, what something happened in the middle of this list,
Yeah. Okay. Well, there was one other thing that I wanted to point out here, and again, this goes down to him going for his notes. I'm not going to speak against somebody because I write my opening statements and debates in advance, and I read them as I go through that, just because I'm not going to memorize this stuff for just a debate. But I have the screen directly in front of me, and I'm able to read and project at the audience, and they're able to see me and see my reactions and stuff. If you're bending over to read your notes when you're doing a debate, you are already hamstringing yourself. So presentation, again, just leaves a lot to be desired.
All right, fair enough. We should keep going.
My turn, I think.
Yes, sir.
Why am I still seeing Walter in my screen and not seeing me in my screen?
I think that's a Zoom setting. The audience can see you. Okay,
All right.
yeah.
All right.
David, I
begin-
see all three people. Shouldn't Logan? Shouldn't David see all three of us like I see?
I see all three as small pictures at the top, and I see your face with that nice background as the main screen.
Okay, I'm just trying to be of help, and don't start
Yeah.
David's time until I shut up.
And so, Logan, can you change whatever it is such that people will be seeing my face in the center of this rather than Walter's? Very good. Walter is hiding himself. I can't even hear Logan.
Whoever is speaking automatically gets full screen on my end. Y'all just have different viewing settings, on
I've
your
got it set to speaker.
Yeah, that's what I have too. It's full screen speaker. The audience sees you center.
So
the only thing is-
what do you mean by my speaking? What do you want me to do such that it will know that I'm speaking?
if you speak, it just automatically knows you're the speaker.
I'm speaking. I'm saying something at the moment, and I'm seeing your face, not Walter's.
Oh, that's because I think you have the audience doesn't see this; they see you. But on your end, I think there's a Zoom setting that makes it so you cannot see yourself. You just see whoever was the last speaker.
Can I control that?
You can. It's in your settings. I'm not really sure how to do that because I'm in full screen right now.
Boomers.
We don't want to be unfair to David. I was able to see David and you, Logan, and I think David should be able to see me and you, Logan.
Yeah, if it helps, it's a lot easier to change it to where you can see everybody. If you press, you could press show grid view,
All right,
or
you might press what? I can press gallery. That's the closest I can come to this. What do you want me to press?
I really feel for this
you're trying to see
moderator.
yourself, right? So you know what you look like when you're speaking.
Yeah. Right.
Okay, so it's kind of complicated on your end because it's a settings issue. But if you press gallery, you can see yourself a little bit smaller.
I pressed gallery. That's what I've just done.
Can you see yourself?
Yeah, but I can see all three of us equal size. I can do that, but I'm used to seeing me the way I was seeing Walter, namely as the main window. If I can't do it, I can't do it. But
I saw the three of us 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3. So I think we're now on a par, David.
you were looking on gallery, and I was looking on speaker.
I don't know what I'm.
But I'll do it this way. Fine. Let's.
Just
I
for
find it less
clarification.
distracting if I'm only seeing myself, but that's not an option here. I can actually, I'm going to move something to cover Walter over so that I don't have to watch his face when.
Oh, I see. Yeah, I see why you. Yeah.
I'll behave,
right.
David.
Sorry, Walter, you've just been banished.
Okay.
You've been
I'll
canceled.
stop. The audience can't see it anyway, so I'll stop my video.
So can you,
Chad move. Chad move.
Logan, you just disappeared. Logan, come back.
now can
I'm
we
here.
start? Can I start now?
Yes.
Start my
Just
timer.
to be clear, the audience only sees whoever speaks. Okay.
All right. The term Austrian appears to mean different things to different Austrian economists, as I think Walter has suggested. So before doing this debate, I asked Walter if he could point me at a source for his version of Austrianism, and he suggested Rothbard's book, Man, Economy, and State. So in my talk, I want to do three things. First, I want to focus on what I see as the central difference between the Chicago School approach and the Austrian approach. Second, I want to show why the Austrian approach is wrong. And third, with whatever time I have left after doing those things, I want to go through a number of the places where Rothbard's errors, in my view, illustrate the fact that the Austrian approach is wrong, where he is saying things that are not, in fact, defensible. So I should start by saying that the Austrian approach and the Chicago approach have a good deal in common. The Austrian approach starts out with Mises's statement that human action is purposive behavior. And my standard definition of economics is the approach to action, the approach to behavior, which starts with the assumption that individuals have objectives and tend to choose the correct way of achieving them. So that's pretty much the same. And a lot of the mechanics of demand and supply curves and marginal utility and such are the same. So what's the difference? The Chicago approach is to use that theoretical structure to create plausible conjectures, then to test those conjectures against the real world. And let me take the example that Walter also used of the minimum wage. An economist would expect that raising the minimum wage would reduce the employment opportunities of the sort of workers who get minimum wage, that is, relatively unskilled workers. That is an argument, but it is not a proof. It does not show it has to be true, and I will illustrate a little bit later why it doesn't have to be true. So having formed the conjecture, you then find real-world tests of it. You look for situations where a minimum wage was raised by a good deal, nothing else much was happening that would change things, and where there is some subset of the population you have data on, which consists largely of unskilled workers, such as teen workers, and you see if that confirms the conjecture. And it does fine. You've got a little bit more reason to believe what you suspected was true before. You've now improved the odds. What if it doesn't? Well, one possibility is you made a mistake in the testing, that you missed the fact that something important was happening that was increasing the demand for such labor. It's possible you made a mistake in the theory. I'll be giving you, in fact, an example of just that in a little bit. And it's possible that your mistaken argument depends on factual claims, maybe factual claims you hadn't realized you were making, you hadn't thought of the alternatives, and those factual claims are wrong. That's, as I see it, the basic structure of what's going on. Let me give an example of a different advantage to trying to test your theories. My first published journal article was an economic theory of the size and shape of nations. It was an attempt to explain the general pattern of the map of Europe from the fall of the Roman Empire to the present, an ambitious paper. I submitted it to the Journal of Political Economy, and George Stigler, who was the editor, rejected it. And he rejected it on the grounds that to be publishable in his journal, an article had to have not only a theory, but some evidence. And he had some suggestions, none of which I thought were workable for testing my theory, but I, in fact, thought up some ways of testing the theory, and I tested it. And on the whole, it did pretty well. And one result of that was that I was a little more sure that my theory described something in the real world. But the other result was that in order to test it, I had to think much more carefully about what my theory said. As long as the theory is just words on paper, you can be pretty vague about it and not realize you're being vague. When you get to the point of what fact in the real world would be evidence for this theory, what real world predictions does it make, you then have to think through much more carefully what your theory is saying. That was my experience, and I have been grateful to George Stigler ever since for that lesson. What is the alternative approach? The Austrian, or at least the Rothbardian approach. And the Rothbardian approach, as I think you can see in what Walter has just been saying, is that you deduce a theoretical structure from axioms, and you deduce it with certainty. It's known a priori. Furthermore, you then use that theoretical structure to reach conclusions about the real world. That's what people are mostly using economics for, not just as an elegant theoretical structure. Why doesn't that work? It doesn't work because there are no conclusions about the real world, or at least none that I have ever thought of or had suggested to me, that you can actually determine with certainty from the theoretical structure. To begin with, we do not know what people's preferences are. Rothbard, by the way, agrees with that statement. I can give you the page number if you like. We do not know, we know that people are acting to achieve their objectives, but not what the objectives are. Any action at all could be rational behavior, could be acting to achieve your objective. All you need is that the action is itself your objective. The way I put it in one of my books is, why am I standing on my head on the table with a burning $1,000 bill between my toes? Because I want to stand on my head on the table with a burning $1,000 bill between my toes. Logically possible, does not contradict any axiom of economics, however unlikely it may seem. So let me take the case of minimum wage. My old argument on the minimum wage, on why it didn't have to be true that what we expected was true, why it didn't have to be true that raising the minimum wage reduced the demand for unskilled labor, was to imagine a world where the people who consumed the products of unskilled labor had a very strong prejudice against consuming things that were made by low-paid workers. So strong that without a minimum wage, the equilibrium wage would be, say, $8 an hour. And they didn't want to consume things that they thought were being made by $8 an hour workers, and therefore there was a low demand for those kinds of goods. If you add to that,
just wanted to quickly say that I saw Janos in the chat saying he looks like the guy who logics himself into taking poison in The Princess Bride, which is funny because, as a matter of fact, that the dude who plays that role, the Princess Bride, Wallace Shawn, is a socialist and has written extensively about it. So he might look like him, but his views are very different.
I just really, a couple of things. One, I positively love that he started off with 3 points here. I've said this before a lot of times. One means you're lying. 2 points of data means to the person listening means you're either an idiot or you're hiding something. 4, their eyeballs roll back in their head and they stop listening. Rule of 3, humans think in threes. If you're ever trying to make a point, do your best to make your lists conform to threes, and you'll find that people are much more inclined to listen to you. And I love his point about testing something, making you think more deeply about it than you realize you had. I mean, just chef's kiss. One last thing also, by the way, standing on your head with a flaming $1,000 bill between your toes. I have not had that particular fetish, but I get it.
Fair enough. Yeah, it's an example. I mean, not actually doing it, but it's an example that definitely fits his personality. I think that, I don't know. I mean, so far, obviously they both believe things that are very false about the minimum wage and all of that, and they have and they have I think deeply evil policy views, but just in terms of what they're arguing about in this debate, all Friedman's really said so far is that if you're going to make substantive assertions about reality, then you need to actually look at the evidence. It's one thing to gather together plausible sounding things to come up with initial conjectures, but then you need to go out into the world and check to see if your conjecture is true. So, so far I'm on Team Friedman.
Oh yeah, you can tell he's a writer. He writes his own fantasy novels or sci-fi novels, I think, and you can tell just between how disorganized Block's opening was and how organized and quick and orderly this is. I also like that he's speaking much more slowly. That's a big power move. A lot of people, myself included at times, speak way too quickly in a debate. So I love that, because you can sometimes slow down and force your opponent to kind of match your speed. And then it gives you, if nothing else, a psychological edge.
Yeah. This is maybe restating what I said earlier, but in a different way. The claim that praxeology is a branch of logic is just bizarre. Logic is about the relationship between statements, right? If this is true, then is this other thing true too, right? That's what logic is about. And whether it be or not, you're being consistent. It can't be a branch of logic if you're making claims about human motivation and all this stuff. I mean, you're this is, very bad social science, but I mean, whatever it is, let's assume for the sake of argument that there is some way of just magically inferring how economies work a priori without having to check, it still wouldn't be a branch of logic. That's just not what logic is. But anyway, whatever. All right.
At the assumption that the producers have no easy way of proving to the consumers what they pay, because it's a complicated market system where by the time the consumer gets it, it has to be different hands and has input from multiple producers and such. It then follows that in that rather unlikely world, when you impose a $10 an hour minimum wage, the cost of labor goes up, but the demand for that kind of labor goes up a whole lot more, because now all of these people are willing to buy these goods because they know they're being made by what they think are properly paid workers. And therefore the demand for the unskilled labor goes up, not down. That is not something I would expect to happen, but it is logically possible. Hence, you cannot deduce the opposite on the basis of the theory. Furthermore, we not only don't know preferences, we don't know technologies. We don't know a priori, we don't know from our economic theory, what are the ways of converting one good into another, or for that matter, well, utility function. We don't know what are the ways of converting goods into happiness, into utility. So let's take what's in fact a more plausible argument against the minimum wage, and this is the one that Cart and Kruger actually make. Suppose you had an economy where most employment of unskilled workers was by monopsonies. That is, by firms where one firm is the only employer of a group of workers. So if you imagine a society with multiple villages, a village has one firm that's employing unskilled labor. Due to the economies of scale, which are a feature of the technology that you can't predict, it doesn't pay another firm to come in. There's only room for one firm in that particular market. And if you run through the perfectly standard economics, the same economics that a good Austrian as well as a good Chicago school person has to follow, it turns out that a monopsony firm employing labor will choose to employ less than the optimal amount of labor. It will not employ up to the point where the last worker just costs as much as he produces, because by employing less labor, they can hold the wage rate down. And they save more on the wages they aren't paying on the lower wage for the bulk of their employees than they lose through not hiring the last 10% of the possible labor. In that world, if you pass a minimum wage at the appropriate level, now the employers know that they can't gain by hiring fewer workers because it's not legal to pay them less. So now they hire up to the marginal revenue value product full wage level, which is the standard competitive equilibrium. So it is therefore entirely logically possible, consistent with all of our theory, given certain facts about the technology, to have a world where raising the minimum wage to some level actually, sorry, I just got a phone call, which I'm going to hang up, actually raises the demand for unskilled labor. I don't expect it to happen in our economy, but one could imagine an economy where it would happen. Hence, the question of the effect of minimum wage is not a question you can answer on theoretical grounds. I should say this argument, I got it from Cart and Kruger, but I'm busy. I got it from Cart and Kruger, but it turns out that George Stigler pointed that out something like 40 years earlier, or 50 years earlier, in an article on minimum wage, where he pointed out that if you had a monopsony employer, this result would apply. So what is the Chicago solution to this problem? The problem is that the theory is not adequate to reach any real world conclusions at all, to reach any real world conclusions with certainty. The answer is that we do not know what preferences are, but we know quite a lot about preferences. We're human beings. We observe other human beings. We therefore have a pretty good guess that a human being will not actually want to stand on his head on a table with burning $1,000 bill between his toes. We have a pretty good guess that consumers don't put an enormous weight on knowing what the workers who produce the thing consume paid. We have some information about technology. We, in fact, know that in our economy, unskilled workers are not specialized. Therefore, it is unlikely there will be one employer for all of the unskilled workers in San Jose. We also know that in our economy, people are pretty mobile. So if there's a substantially higher wage for unskilled workers in Oakland than in San Jose, that workers will work there. So we have good reason to expect that both of my reasons for the minimum wage having the wrong effect, having the opposite of the expected effect, don't hold. But that depends on beliefs about facts in the real world, which are not known with certainty. So therefore, we use the theory to form reasonable conjectures. We then test them against real world data to get evidence as to whether those conjectures are right or wrong. And then we have the extra benefit that if it turns out the test says we're wrong, that may make us rethink the argument and we might spot a mistake. For a long time, the best example I could find of a world where minimum wage didn't have the usual effect was my crazy one where the consumers all want to buy things made by well-paid workers. Only when I came across Card and Kruger did I realize I'd actually left out a possibility that if it was not a competitive market, but a monopolistic market, then the argument would go through. So conclusion is that the conclusion of economic arguments always depend on uncertain facts, sometimes depend on reasoning that might be wrong, and therefore having reached a conclusion that you think is true, you should test it. All right, that's my summary of the basic difference. And so let me now go on to explain what is wrong with a variety of the arguments Rothbard makes. And I don't assume that these are all mistakes made by all Austrian economists. I don't even assume they're all mistakes made by Walter, although I think most of them are, as far as I can tell. And I want to start with two examples where he claims to derive a general principle with certainty. And the first one is declining marginal utility. And he makes the standard argument that all of us make, which is that your first gallon of water goes to the most important purpose, the next gallon to the next most important purpose, and so forth. Consequently, the additional value of 5 gallons instead of 4 is less than the additional value of 4 gallons instead of 5. But then the obvious problem is that there are cases where that isn't true. My standard example is that the value of having 3 tires for my car instead of 2 is quite a lot less than the value of having 4 tires for my car instead of 3. And you can think of lots and lots of other examples of that sort. And Rothbard knows that that's a problem, but he doesn't, as far as I can tell, have any solution to it. He says that what's really going on is that the right unit, he doesn't give that example, but he has one involving eggs, that the right unit is 4 tires, but how do you know that from your theory? Your theory doesn't tell you that. So in fact, anytime that you get rising, increasing rather than decreasing, you could always explain it away by saying the right unit is 17, not 16 of these things. But your theory doesn't tell you any of that. So in fact, if what you're trying to make is a claim about the real world, the claim you can make is that you will have declining marginal utility in those cases where what you do with the earlier units does not add additional possibilities you didn't have before to do with the later units. Or if you want to be fancy, an additive utility function, which I'm not going to go into any details on. He makes the same kind of mistake with regard to the marginal utility of leisure. He says that you will always.
There's a lot wrong with this. We can talk about it when it's over, but going to your point that he's a much better presenter than Walter Block, you notice he just like made a choice about which details were actually important enough to his argument to get into.
Yeah.
not just like throwing forth like everything that like he could think of that was in some way related to what he was arguing.
I really love that zinger he had in there where he's talking about all the things that Rothbard got wrong, and he comes across, he's coming out being very nice and charitable. Oh, I don't think that all Austrians think this. I don't even necessarily think that Mr. Block thinks this. Maybe most of the wrong things, Mr. Block. That's a great zinger, and like it doesn't look like he's trying for a zinger, so that just makes it even better.
Yeah. But I mean, like just the fact that he was like, hey, here's this technical point that like we'd get totally lost in if I started making it. I'll refer to it. If you want to talk about it, we can talk about it. Right. But like I'm not gonna stop everything for 5 minutes while I draw things on MS Paint to illustrate it. Like, points for that.
By the way, the call, someone out there, if there's someone in our audience that is a video editor, please edit in who that was that he just called twice. Oh, make a great.
No, I mean that really, like at that point, he looked less like the logics himself into drinking poison guy from Princess Bride. I mean, like something about that moment, like he seemed like the mostly dead guy from Princess Bride. Just something about the, I'm busy.
Oh, that was really nice. Press F to pay respects to that phone call.
Always value the second hour of leisure less than the first hour. That's obviously wrong, because there are some ways of using leisure where you want to do something. It's something that's fun to do, but it takes 2 hours. So if you have 1 hour, you do something you don't like as much, that's still consuming hours for leisure. And therefore you get greater utility having 2 hours instead of 1 than having 1 hour instead of none. So those are both cases where he claims and goes on to use in his arguments that he knows with certainty declining marginal utility for both consumption and leisure, and neither of those is true. Let me take another case, one which struck me as an unusually careless argument, and that's positive time preference. The question is, would people rather have an ice cream cone today or an ice cream cone tomorrow or the next day, and so forth? And the usual pattern we see is that people generally prefer to have their pleasures, their utility earlier. The question is, can you prove it? And here is what Rothbard writes on page 15 of Man, Economy, and State. A fundamental and constant truth about human action is that man prefers his end to be achieved in the shortest possible time. Given the specific satisfaction, the sooner it arrives, the better. This results from the fact that time is always scarce and a means to be economized. Well, think about that for a minute. Waiting to have my ice cream cone does not use up a single minute of the time I can use for either labor or leisure. All right, his point about time, that time is scarce and a means to be economized, means that I don't want to waste time doing things. It has nothing at all to do with whether I want to get a particular consumption pleasure now or in the future. So he's simply confusing two different senses of using time. One of them using time to actually do things which consumes it. And one of them is spending time waiting for something. And while you're waiting, you can be doing your labor or doing your leisure or whatever you please. So neither of those folks. Let me now go on to the particular weird view of Rothbard's that struck me a long time ago. And that's his opposition to fractional reserve banking. And I'm talking now about private fractional reserve banking, which is what existed in Scotland when Adam Smith was writing. Fractional reserve banking, the bank has banknotes, currency, which say something like 1 ounce of silver payable on demand. And what makes it fractional reserve is that the bank has, say, 10,000 such notes in circulation, but only 5,000 ounces of silver in its vault. And Rothbard argues that that's fraud. And the reason he thinks it's fraud is that he thinks that that banknote is a warehouse receipt, a claim against an ounce of silver. But of course it isn't. It's a claim to be paid an ounce of silver. In order to honestly agree to pay somebody something, you don't have it at the moment. You only have to be able to have it when he comes in. Well, what happens? The bank, of course, in addition to its ounces of silver, also has other assets. In the case of the Scottish banks, they were unlimited liability partnerships. Generally, one of the partners was a wealthy man, so they had additional assets. So if everybody wants their silver, the first, I don't remember how many I said, the first 500 come in, the bank gives them their ounces. The bank then sells some of its assets to buy another 500 ounces and pay those to the second 500 to come in. So there is nothing fraudulent about the fact that the bank has a promise to pay, which it expects to be able to fulfill, even though it does not have as many ounces sitting in its vault as it has notes circulating. And if Rothbard really believes that it's fraud to agree to give somebody something you don't have, I hope he never took an advance on any book he wrote. Because when you take an advance on a book you wrote, you are being paid for agreeing to deliver something which you do not yet have. Now, it turns out, oddly enough, that Rothbard's mistake with fractional reserve banking is closely related to a mistake or a problem in Rothbard's argument that Walter has pointed out. Walter has this nice article which points out that according to both Rothbard and Mises, it does not matter how much money you have, how much money exists. Because if you have half as many gold coins, they'll be worth twice as much. Consequently, the quantity of money in terms of purchasing power is the same, independent of how many gold coins you have. And as Walter points out, that's a problem for Rothbard, because it looks as though the market equilibrium, which has got some particular number of gold coins, is wasting resources on digging gold out of the ground and turning it into coins, when if only the government intervened and taxed or limited the mining of gold, gold would be worth more. You could therefore do the same monetary work with less gold, and you would have saved the resources used to mine gold. I should say, although Walter didn't know it, that argument actually was made by David Ricardo about a little more than a century ago. What Walter's explanation, I'm sure Walter does not believe in the heresy that the government can make things better. And he does, at the moment, at least so far, believe in the idea that fractional reserve banking is a wicked, fraudulent activity. At least I think he does. So what his response is to that, I'll let him tell you. But my response, of course, is that fractional reserve banking is precisely the free market's response to the fact that digging up gold is costly. Because by having a fractional reserve bank, you economize on your gold. You are able to do the money work of 1,000 ounces of gold with only mining 500 ounces. And if your fractional reserve gets down to 10%, you can do the money work of 1,000 ounces of gold, or in the Scottish case, silver, with only 100 ounces. So in fact, the fractional reserve bank is the market response to the fact that digging gold out of the ground is expensive, and that you want money, and that you can provide the money services at a lower cost than that. Digging some gold out of the ground is still worth doing, because in order for the bank to provide money services, it has to be able to show the people holding its notes that the notes are good for something. That means it has to have enough gold in its vault so that when somebody comes in, they can redeem the notes. And by the time someone else comes in, they can have bought some more gold. So in fact, I thought it was rather neat that Walter had pointed at a problem of Murray's, and a problem that would be solved if only Walter would abandon this silly idea that promising to pay something when you don't have that particular something available in sufficient supply to pay it to everybody is fraud. All right, I see I've got a little bit more time, so I want to go on to the last chunk, which is Rothbard's discussion of monopoly. He has a number of arguments. Early on, he says that a monopoly or a cartel that chooses to reduce output in order to raise the price because the demand curve is inelastic can't be hurting consumers. Because after all, if it was hurting the consumers, then the consumers just get together and buy less. I quote from page 635, if the consumers were really opposed to the cartel action, and if the resulting exchanges really hurt them, they would boycott the monopolistic firm or firms. They would lower their purchasing so that the demand curve became elastic, and the firm would be forced to increase its production and reduce its price again. Notice that what he's assuming there is that the fact that if all of the consumers did it, they would all be better off, implies that individual consumers would do it. But each individual consumer out of the million consumers of the monopoly's product, each individual consumer knows that his reducing his demand will have essentially no effect on the monopoly. He's only 1 in a million. Consequently, his reducing his demand will make him worse off, good, and won't benefit him. So the implicit assumption that Rothbard is making, which is an extraordinary assumption to make, and he never makes it explicit, is that if there is a group of people who would all be better off if all of them did something, then it will happen, however large the group. Very odd.
That is a very odd claim.
It is a very odd claim. I also have to say, I find it kind of amazing to see David Friedman pointing out that it's a very odd claim, because as I recall, his argument against me relied on making basically exactly that claim, right? Like that I say that workers are exploited in traditional capitalist firms, and would benefit from reorganizing the economy, so they could have democratic control over the workplace. And he says, hey, if they all got together, they could they could all just start worker-owned businesses, and here it's technically possible. And what's wrong with that is exactly what he's correctly pointing out is wrong with Rothbard's argument here, right? Just because you have a group of people who would all benefit from something does not in fact mean that it's realistic to think that that everybody's going to get together and do it. There are these collective action problems where it might not be especially individually rational for somebody to spend all their savings on this, or whatever, right? That they even though the net result of everybody doing it would benefit everybody, that's, which again, it's a great point, right? That the real world is full of little prisoners' dilemmas like that, but I think it's a point that he forgets in the excitement of defending capitalism.
Yeah. Or here's the other thing, or he learned it from you. There's you may have affected him dialectically, sir.
Yeah, well, maybe. I suspect that my saying that was not his first introduction to the point. I do just think it's kind of funny. But anyway, let's keep going.
Yeah, wait. Before we go on, there was one thing that I wanted to say. A man always wants to economize his time. No wonder libertarians are so bad in bed.
All right.
Claim for somebody who believes in methodological individualism to make. Furthermore, he's not consistent, because at other parts of the chapter, he argues probably correctly that cartels will tend to be unstable because an individual member of the cartel will see that by cheating on the cartel agreement, he can make more money. But of course, if it were really true that groups always act in the group interest, then the members of the cartel would see that they are better off if only they all abide by the cartel agreement, in which case the cartel wouldn't break down. So what he is doing is making an absurd assumption that you can demonstrate that something doesn't injure people, because if all of them did something, they could stop it. From that assumption, and he's only making it when he needs it in order to try to reach the conclusion that he wants. Let me go on to another point he makes. He says that the standard analysis he's rejecting compares monopoly price to competitive. The thing is a competitive price because the competitive price is the price that would be charged by a firm was facing a perfectly elastic demand curve, meaning a firm that could sell as much as it wanted at the market price and nothing beyond that. Well, he says there are no such firms. After all, even if there are 1 million wheat farmers, when one wheat farmer produces more, that will affect the price. Yeah, it'll affect the price. It'll lower the price by 1/billionth of a cent, say. All right. Well, it's not as if Rothbard is not willing, when he wants to make an argument, to recognize that the fact that something is almost true is usually enough to make it useful. He claims, after all, that the law of one price is a tendency. Well, if it's a tendency, that means it's not exactly true, right? And yet he wants to use the law of one price. Well, if you are 1 out of 1 million wheat farmers, the demand curve you are facing is close enough to perfectly elastic so that figuring out what you would do if it was perfectly elastic is a pretty good way of figuring out what you will in fact do. And other places, Rothbard makes essentially the same. Rothbard is perfectly willing to ignore very small things when that's convenient, but somehow the fact that perfectly elastic isn't quite perfectly elastic means there is no such concept. Right? Let me go on, however, to what is really wrong, most seriously wrong with that chapter. And that is that Rothbard goes through an entire chapter on monopoly, attacking a variety of arguments, many of which most economists would attack, and never once mentioning the standard economic argument against monopoly. There is no way that somebody who has no other source of information and reads that chapter will ever know what the position is that Rothbard is rejecting. What is that standard argument? The standard argument is that if you shift from the competitive price to the monopoly price, that the result will be a gain to the seller that is smaller than the loss to the buyer. That the buyer and seller together are on net worse off as a result of that change. Never mentioned. All right, that's where he's trying, in a sense, to undercut it by saying there's no such thing as the competitive price, and maybe no such thing as a monopoly price. I'm not sure, but that's the basic argument. He never mentions it. Now, you might say, Rothbard might say, or Walter might say for Rothbard, that's all right. After all, as Walter has been pointing out in his talk, you don't have a good way of doing interpersonal utility comparisons. Since you don't have a good way of doing interpersonal utility comparisons, it doesn't mean anything to say that changing from one price to another hurts one person more than it helps the other. That's a fine argument, but if you really accept that argument, then most of what Rothbard's book says is nonsense. Because Rothbard says, for example, page 658, we simply conclude that the relative extent of areas within or between firms on the free market will be precisely that proportion most conducive to the well-being of consumers and producers alike. What does it mean to be most conducive to the well-being of consumers? Consumers are not all identical. A different arrangement, something other than the market outcome, would make some consumers better off or some producers. A steel tariff will make steel manufacturers better off and the rest of us worse off. So if you really are unwilling to in any way add up costs and benefits across different people, then any statement such as most conducive to the well-being of consumers is just nonsense. It's rhetoric. That means that in order to make any such statements, you need something like the standard economic definition of economic efficiency, which we get from Alfred Marshall ultimately, though we didn't use that term, which is a way, not a very good way, but I think the best way we have, of saying what represents a net improvement or a net worsening in the economy and the society. It's not GNP, that's nonsense, of course, as I hope Walter knows. And I do not think that Ronald Coase ever says that maximizing GNP is his objective. Maximizing human welfare is an objective. And we have a way of doing comparisons. And it's not a very good way, but as far as I know, the Austrians haven't offered a better one. All right, I think that covers most of what I wanted to say. I've got much more extensive critiques of Rothbard. I have webbed them. There are 7 pages of them. I put them in the chat, but if I've got a few seconds at the moment, I can show you the URL that they are in. Let me do a share screen for a moment, and
I'll post that in the Discord. So
Here
if you
we
send
are.
any links, I can send it to our audience directly, and they can open it.
does this work? Am I sharing the screen?
Yes, it's working.
Right, that's the URL. So I'll just put that up, and I think that does it. And I think Walter is supposed to be rebutting at this point, if I understand it correctly.
Yes, sir. Your time just finished.
And I can thank him for having confirmed many of the things that I am saying about Austrian economics. His turn.
Oh, bang. Oh, beautiful.
All right, that was funny.
Yeah.
The just slid in so gently there at the end. Although I also got to say, all right, it was awesome when David couldn't figure out Zoom, and like it was
Yeah.
beyond him that like what he was seeing on his screen wasn't what everyone was seeing on their screen. And and Walter, got like sympathetically agitated for him, even though you could clearly see him on his screen. And so that was great. Also, but like, also the fact that like throughout most of that, David seems so much saner than Walter, but then like at the end, he has to say, like, all right, I somehow restrained myself from including all this here, but I have webbed 7 pages, like, like first just the fact that he used the word webbed, and then that it was that he put 7 pages of notes in the Zoom chat.
Well, and not only that, he put the URL up on the screen. Oh, it's adorable. It genuinely is. Oh. I do want to say, though, I love that Friedman was paying attention to his time from the beginning. He has obviously prepared and is taking this much more seriously, and it shows. So points to him there. Not a good way. It's the best way we have. If the woman floats and she is wood.
Because he was saying like like his defense of his methodology at the end is it's not good, but it's the best we have. Like that, there's got to be some kind of initial bar before it made better than the alternatives. Is enough to sell it. But I just want to like, okay.
I'm very glad we did this one.
Yeah, that was very well organized. I think, like Walter Block was just kind of like, oh, so you want to learn praxeology from me? Okay, well, I will just start out. I'll just give you an hour from a lecture I would give about this. If we had 32 hours to do it, I'll just give you the first hour. I don't know. It's So the utils. Let's do the utils. Okay, no, I'll do this on MS Paint. I assume you know the underlying theory here. Okay, all right. So the x-axis here, and it's like, how does this go back? Like, because it's like first I was hearing about synthetic a priori, and like we were just doing an extensive defense of that, and then somehow we just veered into this hyper technical economic point, and then we're doing like what his favorite comedians are.
There's no composition to what he's doing. He's just throwing stuff out.
Exactly. It's just kind of like, I mean, it's just Austrian economic stream of consciousness is what we got from Walter. Whereas like with David, he actually had like a well-organized presentation. Although I will say he kind of finished his real presentation and it's like, oh, I've got 10 minutes left. Okay, well, here are 4 things that Murray Rothbard gets wrong, like, and that wasn't like the first 20 minutes were him actually making his case against Austrian economics. And then afterwards, it was like, oh, I guess I've got 10 minutes. Well, I have pages and pages of notes about what stuff that Rothbard got wrong. So I guess we'll do a few pages.
Yeah. And I think from a debating standpoint, it's better to just, if you get to the end of your statement and you have time left, just stop. Don't go on, because it's not going to be as powerful.
Yes.
I will say though, I hate
Rothbard. Find ways to fill the time.
Yeah. No, I will say I hate Rothbard though, so I'm very happy that I now have a bunch of other reasons to dislike Rothbard that I didn't have before. So thank you. Hats off to you, sir.
Also, I mean, it's funny because he like sort of said in passing that like he kind of like in the minimum wage discussion, he was like, oh, before I got this argument from Card and Kruger, the only way I could think of that raising the minimum wage wouldn't increase unemployment would be if just people were really motivated to buy products from higher paid workers. And of course, we all know that that's very unrealistic. So it's like, okay, pause on that, right? Because like, if you acknowledge that it's very unrealistic that people just using their consumer power will result in wages being increased that way. And also government minimum wages are bad.
Yeah.
then like, is there any way that you think like is acceptable but also might work to raise poor people's wages, or is that just like, should we just not do that?
I have a feeling the implication is we should just not do that. It's really interesting though with regard to this, because okay, so let's take his example of the society where people are really, really motivated to hire, to buy products from people who pay their workers well. This is the same problem as greenwashing. It will be cheaper for the employer to invest in a publicity campaign to make it look like they are treating their workers well and paying high wages, but actually they aren't, than it will be to actually pay those high wages. In much the same way, it is much cheaper for a company to call itself green and to put up a big show of being green, but ultimately the incentive there is no market incentive, even if the consumer does want them to be green.
Yeah. It's like when the Simpsons are touring the Malibu Stacy factory, and and the woman says, a certain percentage of each one comes from use recycled material. At least it says, oh, what percentage? Like 0.
Yeah. I love we got 2 Simpsons references in already.
Like, it's like, yeah, I mean, it's like, come up with the right words to say in the right order, and like hope realistically that nobody's going to like look into it that much, because like, why would they?
Yeah.
And yeah, no, that's absolutely right. But it's just, yeah, it's so weird. Like that he can't, I mean, again, points for being more reasonable than Walter Block, because at least he's willing to acknowledge the theoretical possibility that in some almost impossible to imagine crazy world, it could be that his libertarian economics predictions, weren't right. Like, so that is a long step in the right direction. But like, also, man, that is just not a lot of creativity in like thinking about different ways that this could play out. So, such that like you could raise the, reasons why you could raise the minimum wage and it wouldn't affect employment very much.
Well, it also makes sense that like, okay, so we know from the last few months that all of these companies could, obviously afford to raise the minimum wage. I mean, you've got now, Wendy's and McDonald's offering $13 to $15 an hour plus $500 sign-on bonuses, and then another $500 bonus if you stay like a couple of months or something. And they could always afford to do that. They just didn't want to. So like the idea that, if you raise the minimum wage, people won't be hired. It's ridiculous, because what they already have the gas pedal all the way to the floor. They're already paying as few people as possible to do the job, to make as much profit as possible. So really these wages, the issue here is one of supply and demand. It's not really an issue of how much value a worker like individually produces.
Well, that's the thing too, right? Because when he was going over the Card and Kruger argument, he was like, okay, only under like quasi monopoly conditions could he imagine it being true that you didn't hire workers right up until the point where hiring one more would mean that you'd be losing more money than you'd get. And it's like, this is such a weird, like, okay, again, it's better than praxeology. Like, like at least he's acknowledging, on some theoretical level that, that it's possible for this stuff to be refuted. But like, does he really believe that managers are in any position to know that? Like that they, like you can exactly quantify, like, here's exactly how much, this particular worker is adding, that we'd be losing if we didn't have him. Like that, that just always seems like such a crazy assumption. If you think about how any business actually works in the real world, that you would like have it down to that much of an exact science.
Yeah, I mean, I worked as a manager for over a decade, and like my hiring decisions were based upon, I had, so essentially from the higher ups, I would have a certain number of hours I was expected to run, and they would have a minimum amount of they would have like minimum standards that a worker that I hires must meet to keep the job. And by the way, they were always producing way more money than they were taking home, like 2 or 3, 4 times that. But like, yeah, I don't think I've ever gotten to a point where when I was hiring, I was thinking like, oh, well, if I hire one more person, we'll start losing money. No, that's just not those decisions that are made on the ground are not made in that highly technical way.
No.
At least not in my experience. I've never seen a manager who does think like that.
No, I mean, again, that's just like, I mean, this is part of the thing too. Like, this is the problem that like even good, economics, like once you've picked a bunch of plausible sounding assumptions, it's easy to, not easy, whatever. I mean, there's technical skill. I don't want to underplay it, but like, it's like theoretically easy to then like spin out your mathematical model of exactly how it would work if you make these like, oh, this is happening in this fantasy world where everybody has perfect information about everything that they're doing. But like, no manager, no like small business owner who just runs the place himself is going to be in the position in most of the time, at least. I mean, I'm not saying that there aren't cases where you could be like, oh, we'll lose money if we hire this particular guy. Sure. I mean, if it's small enough operation, whatever, right. You can like, but like the idea that in most cases, like you have it down to that, right. That like, here's how much money that we would be making with this guy hired. Here's how much money we'd be making without him hired. That just seems like a kind of omniscience. It's just bizarre to think that managers are going to have.
Yeah. And also if you think beyond capitalism and profit, he's saying you can't imagine a firm that would hire a worker to where they're not making profit. I mean, I've worked in the theater for years. Like the incentive there to bring on other people, especially if you're able to pay them and you don't make any money off of it, because what you are motivated for, like in the theater, is not profit, but the actual work itself. Like that, right. That's why we do it. So like, the arts right there, I think just blows that point out of the water. Now, granted, the arts is very different than, coal mining. Coal miner's not going to, if there's no coal to mine, he's not going to set up like a little mine and invite all his friends and family and pass out wine. But you get my point here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it'd say that's not going to be like, most of the economy is not going to work like the theater, and fair enough. Mm-hmm. But like, I just. Anyway, it's kind of a small point, but it's kind of not a small point because it does really go to the, like, I think what things like that show is that, like, even though like philosophically he's got a way more defensible position than Walter Block does, mm-hmm. that like in practice his kind of economics isn't quite as far as it should be from praxeology. That like that we're still. We're like still spinning a lot of stuff out of assumptions that, that we're not doing very much in check.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, here's the thing with that. I have a theory about Austrian economics in particular. And I really think that like Austrian economics as a political school, I don't think it's really economic discipline, because like, if you look at the industry, you don't see very many Austrian economists being employed by like, Standard & Poor's, all these top economics and financial firms. You see them getting employed by think tanks and propaganda outlets. Or when they are employed, like even as professors, it's usually like George Mason University, for instance. Like the reason they have that huge kind of libertarian Austrian thing is because the Koch brothers gave them like a bunch of money to make that. So like, I really think that this particular school, it seems that Chicago school economists do get hired to do actual economics. And it does not seem like Austrian economists ever get hired to do actual economics.
Yeah, right. Yeah, that seems right. That like
the market chose.
Yeah, that like you don't seem to see a lot of even being hired by like governments to like give them economic or whatever, like even stuff that it's the Chicago boys, right? It's not the Vienna boys.
You're right. It definitely is. So there was one other thing that was brought up. Oh man, you know what? I forgot it. It'll come back to me.
Okay, fair enough. Well, let's I don't know. We are, I guess, just about exactly halfway through. I don't know. I'm not sure if there's a point where they start taking questions or anything at some point in the video. If so, we usually skip that for these. But since it is almost 11, as I think a few people predicted at the beginning, we are going to change the title of this to part 1 and finish up next week because we are only about halfway through the debate.
I got to tell you, I'm dying to see Walter Block. I'm loving the openings, but I think the real entertainment next week is going to be seeing these two shred each other.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I guess it's funny, right? Because like the experience of us watching this has got to be like the experience of a libertarian, like watching like someone like you or me argue with some like extreme tanky who like defends Pol Pot or something, that it's like, It's like, okay, I don't like what he's saying, right? I mean, he's still a really strident socialist, but I mean, I guess it's nice that he's rejecting Pol Pot, right? That's kind of this is kind of the methodological equivalent of that, that it's like, okay, man, there's so many assumptions I so deeply disagree with here, but like at least he kind of admits that to find stuff out about how economies work, you can't just like derive that, like purely from the thoughts in your mind, without having to access any kind of evidence anywhere. So that's good.
It's just so weird. Oh man. Yeah, I feel like David overall just came across as much more thoughtful. He seemed to take this thing much more seriously. And I gotta say, I don't always like to see like insults and zingers in debates, but man, oh man, they're just so satisfying to see them out of David. He does that so well, and it's so subtle that it doesn't look like he's trying. But then you when he hits some really good, you're like, oh, maybe he is just a little bit.
Yeah. The thing about demonstrating, what he's saying about Austrian economics, was nice at the end. I mean, I guess my biggest, like, just stepping back from the content, like, just as a, when he ran out, like, when he finished his real opening statement, obviously the way better move would have just been like, okay, I'm done early. But if he was going to do 10 minutes of extra stuff, then it seems like you could have done 10 minutes about stuff that Walter Block had said rather than like, here are some random arguments that Murray Rothbard makes I think are wrong.
Yeah. Don't argue with someone who's not there. It's just, It's never a good idea, no matter how good the argument is or how tempting it is to want to make it. Because, I think part of the reason sometimes people do these debates is that we want to get our ideas out into the stratosphere. Sure. And the debate is the excuse that brings in the audience, oftentimes, as opposed to if we were just blogging or making video essays.
Right. Yeah.
So I got a question for you. So far, and I know this is going to be hard, what do you think was Walter Block's best point? Where was he at his strongest?
Where was he at his strongest? Well, I mean, okay. I mean, it's kind of cheating because I think it definitely falls into the category of argue with someone who's not there.
Mhm.
But like, you know, when he was explaining what's wrong with logical positivism, like he was kind of right about that. Like he like not the laundry list of things that are alleged synthetic a priori truths, but like the self refutation argument against logical positivism, that like if you say, you know, here are the only acceptable ways of you know, of establishing something, or anything that doesn't, you know, anything that doesn't check one of these boxes is meaningless, then that very statement doesn't really seem like it checks any of those boxes. And so I think that was like, you know, I mean, it's not like a groundbreakingly original point or whatever, but I mean, I think out of the things that he was saying, like that one was probably the one he was most concise about. And it's like, and whatever, it's a good point. Like that is a real problem for logical positivism, but also, like I said, it's kind of cheating because like, I think he's just assuming that David Friedman is a logical positivist.
Yeah.
Because
which
which is a weird assumption.
It is. You would expect they would know more about each other. If they seem to have known each other for a little bit. Maybe they just never really matched minds like this.
Well, I mean, you'd also think, like, I don't know. I mean, the weird thing about that claim is it's like, if you're going to say that, wouldn't you be like, oh yeah, and as he says, you know, in the machinery of freedom, he's a, you know, logical positivist, you know, like that's, you know, like instead of just like, I don't know, I mean, you're rejecting what I'm saying, so I guess you must be a logical positivist. Also Walter Block seemed to be better at using Zoom than David Friedman, so you know, point for that.
Better at using Zoom, doesn't have a landline that's ringing in the middle of it. So far, you know, we haven't seen part two. I know we've had a lot of praise for Friedman here in terms of his delivery, his professionalism, that kind of thing. Where do you think he was at his weakest?
Well, I mean, of course, I think that a lot of his underlying assumptions are kind of ridiculous, and I also think that I mean, certainly in terms of the presentation, I mean, it's what we've been over extensively, that like the, you know, I've got 10 minutes, so I'm just going to do 2 pages of my notes about Murray Rothbard's book. Like that was definitely, and I'll put the other 7 in the chat, you know, like that's, which is, again, amazing. Like just as I mean, forget economics, forget politics, just as spectacle. I mean, that's the best thing about this was the tech support, and like just the fact, like especially like that detail that he's putting 7 pages of notes in the Zoom chat. It's like, what's your understanding of what Zoom, what like the chat is in Zoom, right? Like who do you think is reading it? Like, do you think there are other people on this call and they're gonna have
and it was the fact that it was in a Microsoft Word document. Like you can't even, because it's on the screen, you can't even like quick grab it, highlight it, and throw it into the top. You got to be like .pdf. Oh no, I left out a space. Yeah, that was almost adorable, but I think it was I think ultimately that took away a bit from it. I don't know. I feel like, you know, in debates, oftentimes people will have their research and they'll be like, oh, I'm going to drop this into the chat afterwards. I think that's a good way to handle it. Unfortunately, some people use that as a tactic where they didn't really do their research and then they say they're going to drop into the chat and they just never do. So they can get away without backing up what they're saying. But at the same time, like I really felt like absolutely everything Friedman said in this, he could back up. My bigger problems were more or less his grounding assumptions about how things are, and sort of like I felt like he had a little bit of tunnel vision. overall. That would be my critique on his ideas. But, you know, as far as like the debate itself, I thought he handled himself masterfully.
Yeah. Yeah, I pretty much agree with Plato's shrimp. Block is wrong because he doesn't use evidence. Friedman is wrong because he uses evidence badly, right? You know, that, and actually his initial example, I think maybe showed how low the bar is there, because he was gonna, like, what was it, the his paper that he was talking about was this like grand theory of how countries end up at the size
That they are.
like it just seemed like, okay, I mean, this is a baby step in the right direction, that you realize that, you know, just like sort of spitting something out a priori that like you can get to match, you know, what happened, like, is not a good enough reason to believe it, right? You know, that's like I'm glad that like journal editor got him to understand that. But also, what I think the next step would be, oh my God, what a crazy thing to try to think that like I could just write a little paper and like I've established that, right? I mean, like that it's like the explanation is like exactly that simple, you know, that I could just model it out like that. And I think that one kind of zany detail sort of stands in for the rest of what was going on with his argument, because like it's like, okay, again, points for like being on the right side of the basic methodological point that like, you know, you cannot predict like really complicated, you know, behavior in economies, you know, like a priori, you know, through the, you know, logical science of praxeology or whatever, which, God, just almost like even the name, right? I mean, like that sounds like such quack shit, you know, praxeology.
Yeah. It's the same, you know, it's the same thing like when they call it, when Marx Leninists call it the immortal science of Marx Leninism. Like,
no, it's exactly the same vibe there. But so I don't know. I mean, it just so it's like, okay, like, yeah, points for being on the right side of that methodological distinction, but also like what you call looking at evidence just seems so minimalistic, right? I mean, it still seems like we're basically just spitting stuff out a priori. And then like, I don't know, there's like some kind of check that happens at some point in the process, but like it just still seems like, I mean, I guess my more fundamental disagreement, like quite apart from all the disagreements about values and sort of how I think history works versus how he does and all that stuff, like just methodologically, I mean, that's my biggest disagreement. Like I think that Block is as wrong as you could possibly be about this, but Friedman is like not much less wrong if you think like I do that, like, you know, the most defensible version of economics, you just understand it as a social science and you have to treat it like a social science, you know, that like you can't, you know, like that, you know, sociology that, you know, that Walter Block thinks everybody who isn't majoring in queer studies is majoring in.
They're so mad about that.
you know, but like this is a good thing about, you know, like at least sociologists don't just say like, oh, well, you know, I've got my 5 generalizations about human behavior, you know, I don't need to do a study, you know, like that, like you have
my
like,
data isn't lining up with these 5 assumptions. Clearly my data is what's wrong here.
yeah.
We can't use data for this. You know what? We just got to start with my assumptions.
Exactly. So it's like, if, you know, praxeology is over here and like actually approaching economics like an empirical social science is over here, then Friedman is here. Right? You know, so it's like it's like a couple steps in the right direction, but not very far is the vibe I get.
Yeah. Now, what I will say though, I actually really appreciated his story with how he came to that conclusion, where he was talking about like his theories of like maps and the formation of countries in Europe. I'm somebody who really tends to respond to if you can tell me a story, I am more likely to understand and absorb the information than if you just give me the facts. And I think a lot of people are like that.
Sure.
So I feel like
I mean, I think human beings in general are kind of like that. You know, we're a narrative species. You know, like you always. I mean, it's kind of a shame on a certain level of description. It makes us like a little bit less rational, but like it's also just kind of the deal.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. But I think this comes back to approaching this from an artistic standpoint. Because comic and theater and stuff. One of the big things that they stress, like in theater school, like when you are trying to craft a play or create any kind of work of art, is it needs to be judged partially, at least, upon artistic unity, that each piece is working with all the others. And like, as I said before, I felt like David had so much more unity in his opening statement than Walter did, which seemed to be just a series of vignettes and assumed arguments. If I had been in Walter Block's place, I might have, because it looks like he didn't do a lot of research, I might have actually asked to go second in the debate itself, so that I would have something to attack, because it's always easier when you're trying to tear down like another idea than to present your own, because it's more likely that you will make a mistake making a positive case than you will make looking for flaws in that positive case.
Yeah, I mean, look, if I were Walter Block, just it's a big adjustment, right? But if I were Walter Block, or I was supposed to make the case that Walter Block is making, like, the people he is channeling here, your Rothbards and your von Mises, I mean, I think they're insane, but they are at least good writers, and I think you could take a cue from how they actually present this same case, right? I mean, so look, if your whole thing, this is roughly the way that that they do, that like Rothbard certainly does in one of his books, like if you're going to make the case that we can derive all of economics from these first principles, like instead of just kind of rambling a little bit about different economists you've known, and then giving the Kant diagram about about knowledge, and then like just I don't know, maybe even give the Kant diagram at the beginning. I wouldn't do it in MS Paint, but like maybe do that at the beginning, and then say, oh, so it might seem crazy to think that we could do anything about economics up here, but consider here are some principles, and then like list them all out, explain them. Give us several of them, explain them as you're giving them, isn't that obviously right? Doesn't that sound reasonable? Right. And then show like a couple things you can do with it, and then say, like the Chicago school people, don't think, don't understand this. And like that, I mean, obviously I would find that like super duper unconvincing. But like just as a presentation, that would have been so much better than what he did.
I will agree with you 100%. So I'm looking forward to next week when this goes on. Before we do, how many shirts would you wear if you were Block? You know what we need to do? We need to combine Walter Block shirts with Tim Pool's socks economy.
No, that's true. I did forget about that, Yados. That if I were Walter Block, I could be king of the black people. So that's that's an interesting thought. Yeah.
By the way, before we head out, there's something that I wanted to bring up to everybody, and it's the one time that I'm going to be pushing a book that's not mine. I have your wonderful Christopher Hitchens book here.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for sending it. Thank you for signing it, and the wonderful message you put in here. I cannot wait to read this book because, as we've said before, Hitchens was a big influence on both of us. And for anybody watching, if you want to know how into Hitchens I was circa like 2010, I named my cat Hitchens. So,
nice.
And then, I grew up.
Yeah. So, Yep. Once I was a new atheist and I believed new atheist things, and then I became a man. And that's right. Yeah. Yeah. Fair enough. Well, speaking of books, do you want to tell us about what you've got going?
Yeah, absolutely. So, hi, folks. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Brent Lengel. I do debates on YouTube. I talk about Buddhism and philosophy, and I am a Ringo-nominated comic creator of Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, which I have a trade coming out for. The very first full-length graphic novel I've put out the Kickstarter page is about to launch. I'm also the creator of Durruti, Shadow of the People, about anarchist Buenaventura Durruti. That's this thing behind me, which is based on one of the most famous pictures of Durruti just after he'd gotten out of prison in France. So what I've got going on right now is I am about to launch a Kickstarter to pay for the creation of my very first graphic novel. That pre-launch page, which is down in the notes, the more people that click on that,
we webbed it.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, you can click on that. I'm not going to show you the link on the screen and ask you to type it in. If you click on that, click notify me. Even if you don't want to get the graphic novel, it would be some great mutual aid, because the more pre-launch followers I have on Kickstarter, the better the algorithm treats me and it shows my book to more people. So if everybody could do me a solid and in solidarity, go down there and click notify me, I would be eternally grateful. So thank you very much. And this book is going to be freaking amazing. Premise with Snow White Zombie is Snow White wakes up to Prince Charming's kiss 28 days after the zombie apocalypse. The 7 dwarves are dead. The prince is polyamorous, and she is dwarfed in power and experience by Rapunzel, Prince Charming's paramour, who is essentially a warrior queen goddess. I'm only slightly exaggerating there. Yeah, so definitely check it out. It's a really fun series. People really love it, and I could honestly use the help. So, thank you very much.
All right. Sounds good. Tune in next week for part 2 when we actually get to see these guys go at it. I expect the topics that are covered are going to include synthetic a priori truth, whether we can imagine a universe in which rent control makes people's lives better, and whether whether the Zoom window that Walter sees is also the Zoom window that David sees. So should be a good time. We'll do that next Thursday. Thanks again, Brent.